welcome David. Thank you very much for coming up.
Well, hi there. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and how I got into this, and then kind of get directly into the whole subject of a rather fascinating subject that seems almost like a hidden history in the United States here. My background is as an ecologist and a biosystematist. So I study how things work in whole systems and teach that through permaculture design courses. And I also was a farmer doing a permaculture design farm in Woodside for about 9 years, where we fed 450 people from 2 acres, which is considered by the USDA to be literally impossible. So I'm really always thrilled when I can do something that people say, oh, you can't do that. You know, and I love to go out there and show them that you can, because usually it takes good design, a little bit of common sense, and some desire to make it happen. And people in this country, I think, genetically are predisposed to be ingenious, because Americans were always known as the tool makers when we came here, because we had nothing. We had to make everything we needed here. And when it came to vehicles, of course, America has been the birthplace, really, of the car industry and the car world and all the technology that goes in around it. For me, finding out about alcohol was this really interesting kind of, I found out about it on a bet. I was looking at a bottle of fermenting beer in our microbiology class back at SF State when I was going to school there about 3 or 4 centuries ago. And the teacher said, that stuff would even run your car. And I looked at the teacher, and he pulled our leg quite a bit and wanted to see if we'd buy it, you know. And I said, I got you this time. You're really pulling our leg. And so I bet him a burrito that he was lying to us. And he said, okay, go to the library. And I took off, and I found a stack of books like this in San Francisco State's library about alcohol fuel. And I was completely floored, because I had never heard anything like this was possible before. And the more I dug into it, the more it was really obvious that it was a kind of buried history, you know, of not only the technology itself, but a political intrigue in the United States. And I really dug into it at the time. But in the mid-'70s, when I was first interested in this, gasoline was like, 60 cents, 70 cents a gallon. It was like, wasn't much possibility of thinking about a way of doing it, other than ecologically. It seemed like such a really positive thing, as you'll be hearing about tonight. And that all changed in 1979, when we had the first Arab oil embargo. And there's enough gray hair in this room to remember what it was like to sit in line to wait for gasoline, simply because, well, there were 2 different oil shocks, but basically because the Arab world had decided our support of Israel was inappropriate, and it embargoed us for oil, and actually caused quite a disruption in the economy of the United States and quite a bit of the rest of the world, actually. And that changed the whole pricing structure of gasoline. And it really happened because the way it got discovered that gasoline's price was so tied in with production, is in Libya, a bulldozer accidentally backed into a pipeline and shut it down and dropped about 3% of the world's oil supply off the map, and all of a sudden everybody started bidding on what was left, and the prices went way up. Well, that's what started OPEC and the idea of using oil as a weapon, is that that's how close it was, how tight the difference was between use and production. So during this time, I took the knowledge I had of alcohol fuel and delved into it quite a bit more and started teaching classes in it back in the late 70s and early 80s. And it caught on really well. I taught over 8,000 people in a very short number of years all over the United States in the early 80s, and ended up doing a 10-part PBS series, which you'll hear more about later on alcohol fuel. So you kind of have to, if you weren't there, it's a little hard to imagine how high everybody was in the early part of the 80s, and I don't mean because what we were smoking then, but because we thought revolution was in the air when it came to alternative energy. Jimmy Carter had passed all these provisions. He put solar panels on the White House. Everybody, it seemed, was working on renewable fuel, and alcohol was taking off, as well as a lot of other alternatives. And what happened at that point, of course, was a big black cloud blocked out the sun. It was called Ronald Reagan, and basically shut down almost all interest in alternative energy across the country. And his little-known running mate at the time, George Bush, manipulated the oil industry to drop the price so that basically there was no interest anymore in alternative energy by about 83 or 84. So that's kind of the modern history of what happened 20 years ago. And it's been very quiet until recently. But I think the history I'd like to tell you about first is where all this came from, where it all started. You know, there's always this chicken or the egg thing. What came first? Did the car come first or did gasoline come first? And it turns out that the internal combustion engine predates gasoline by about 40 years, 30, 40 years. They started running cars in the late 1800s for the first time, and they were very simple engines, etc., but they ran primarily on alcohol. It was the only reliable combustible fuel that was available. Oil had already been discovered, but it had a whole different role in our country. It was used for heating and lighting homes because oil and, to some degree alcohol was an expensive alternative to this stuff they could just get out of the ground. Because remember, when the first oil that they started pumping in Pennsylvania was very close to the surface, it was really easy to recover and really cheap. So the part that they couldn't use for heating and lighting homes, the stuff that tended to explode and nobody wanted to put it in an oil lamp, they threw away, literally threw away. And so Rockefeller, doing some experimentation, figured out that although it didn't do such a good job of this, it would run a car too, and started selling it at dirt cheap prices in the cities where he had his oil distribution business. So gasoline was an industrial waste byproduct that was marketed as an alternative to the standard fuel, which was alcohol during the time. And many of the first cars ran on either fuel. But I just want to underscore the fact that oil as a transportation fuel was a toxic waste byproduct that was being dumped into the transportation system, because this theme is going to come back right up till today. So Rockefeller was selling oil, and the big proponent of alcohol in cars was Henry Ford. He thought that alcohol was the very best fuel for cars, and it was clean, it was efficient, and as Henry Ford used to say, there were a lot more stills in this country than there were service stations. And this was very, very true in the late 1800s, early 1900s. People in this country distilled a lot of alcohol. Anybody here read The Botany of Desire? Anybody? Okay, a few of you have. One of the first chapters is about apples in the United States. And apples, when they were first grown in the United States, weren't these beautiful, sweet, highly bred, grafted, fresh eating apples. People didn't grow apples for that. They grew what we nowadays call spitters, where you take a bite and go, yuck, and spit it out. But they made great cider from that. And alcohol from cider was made almost on every farm as people moved from the east out to the west. And of course, making alcohol from corn was essential, even as far away, or even I should say as close as Pennsylvania was to the East Coast. The Monongahela Valley was a huge alcohol production area because farmers couldn't get their corn to market without it rotting. It would rain, it would have, insects would have trouble, and it wouldn't sell for very much, something that farmers still today have to deal with, which when you have a raw material, nobody wants to pay much for it. So the farmers in Monongahela fermented their corn and made whiskey. In fact, for those of you wondering where whiskey comes from, it's basically corn wine, which is distilled and becomes corn liquor. So just like brandy is the distilled product from wine, whiskey is that from corn. So the farmers in Monongahela were transporting their alcohol to the East Coast and selling it for a pretty penny, and it didn't go bad. It was a value-added product, and this made a lot of sense. And I think what happened in that case is became a paradigm that has carried through to this day, which is the people who were powerful in this country were not the farmers. They were the big Eastern landowners. And when it came to paying for the Revolutionary War, the first proposal was a property tax, because suddenly these guys all had valuable property. It wasn't owned by the king anymore. Well, the big property owner said, screw that noise. We're not going to pay for it. Let's shove it off on the little people somehow. And so they put a sin tax, an excise tax, on alcohol instead. Well, the farmers in Monongahela said, no way, we didn't fight this revolution to get rid of the king and his unfair taxation, just to have you guys tax us, you pay it. So George Washington raised the first draft in this country, drafted 20,000 men, marched them out to Pennsylvania, and they were not in a good mood when they got there, and they killed 200 farmers. okay, to put down what was called the Whiskey Rebellion. So our first draft in this country was not to defend ourselves from a foreign land. It was to put down rebels and radicals in this country, and they were farmers. So they killed the 200 farmers. Of course, it didn't stop the production of alcohol. And of course, the big distilleries on the East Coast, although they first were objected to the regulation of alcohol, they said, wait a minute, we can handle this. The small guys can't. So they actually ended up supporting it. And it turned out that George Washington was the biggest distiller in the United States. So he was using an army to go out and put down his personal competitive opponents, you know. Sounds a little vaguely like today, doesn't it? So what happened with all that? Well, basically the farmers found out that they, you know, couldn't do things in the open anymore, so they generally ran off their booze at night, and they became known as moonshiners. So the whole term moonshiners came from farmers paying off their land. And farmers have been paying off their land for a long time, making illicit alcohol, a tradition that has been carried through in different forms up till today with various other products. So, you know, these themes keep recurring over history. You'll see a few more as we go along. So for a long time, alcohol and gasoline were neck and neck all over the United States. And basically what you did is if you were in the city, you tanked up on gasoline because it was cheap and Rockefeller was throwing it away. And when you wanted to come back home from the countryside, you stopped by a farm, you tanked up on alcohol, you made some changes with the car, and then you drove home. So the Model A was made to do this. It was a dual fuel vehicle right from the start. Henry Ford intended it that way. So anybody here ever have a Model A? Anybody here? Usually there's somebody. You had one, huh? So can you tell me about the digital distributor that Model A's have?
No.
Well,
I had a bigger engine in it.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, the Model A's had a digital distributor. It took all 5 digits to operate it, you know. So a distributor is what tells when the spark should fire in your engine. And as you go faster, you want the spark to fire earlier. And so in modern cars, of course, well, modern cars prior to fuel injection, there was an automatic device, fairly complex device, a distributor with centrifugal weights and vacuum advance and all this stuff that would control when the spark would fire. But back then you listened to the engine yourself and you adjusted it by hand. Now with alcohol, because it's 106 octane, you would start the spark much earlier than you would with gasoline. It was a much slower burning fuel and would burn more completely. So you'd back up the timing a little bit by just pulling a lever on the steering column. And alcohol, which is different than gasoline, gasoline is a hydrocarbon, which means it has hydrogen and carbon. Alcohol is an oxygenated hydrocarbon, so it's got all 3, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. So it needs less air, less oxygen from the air to burn. So you'd have to adjust the amount of air and fuel going into the engine. In those days, and up until not too long ago, that was done with a carburetor. So the Model A had a rod that went right from the dashboard, a little knob on the dash, went all the way to the carburetor, and you could actually adjust how much fuel and air just right there from the dash, you know, and that was how you went back and forth between alcohol or gasoline, depending on what was available. So, as I'll be telling you a little bit later, the ability to dual fuel a vehicle is now currently available, and had, you know, but in the intervening period, you kind of had to be on one or the other. You know, Henry Ford had a lot of compatriots in the alcohol movement, and let's see. This Alexander Graham Bell was a big fan of alcohol fuel. He wrote this in 1922. The world's consumption of fuel has become so enormous as to show that our present supplies cannot possibly last for many generations more. As an alternative, he suggested alcohol, a beautifully clean and efficient fuel, which can be produced from vegetable matter of almost any kind. The waste products from our cities are all available, and even the garbage from our farms. So the whole issue of non-renewability of oil has been clear early on in this country, and people like Ford and Bell said it was a really poor idea to plan to use a fuel that would run out. Ford also used to say that if we can't be the farmer's customer, how can he be ours? And that predates Paul Hawken and the Ecology of Commerce by about 60 years, you know, but it's the same concept, is that we need to patronize each other and not export, you know, our local capital out to people who are not part of our community. And Ford tried to be responsible that way. So Ford and Rockefeller fought tooth and nail over what should be the nation's fuel supply until Rockefeller decided not to play fair anymore. So what he did was rather diabolical. He funded a little group of whacked out old ladies called the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. These people have been around since the late 1800s, championing against demon rum. And so what Rockefeller did is he gave this group $4 million to go ahead and lobby Congress to get alcohol outlawed. And to just kind of put that in a modern context, that would be like giving Jerry Falwell $400 million nowadays to lobby Congress. And you can buy Congress for that. That's pretty understandable. So they did it, and they passed a law called Prohibition, which you've all read about or heard about, and you thought it probably had something to do with drinking and moral decay of the United States. So can you imagine an all-male Congress voting to prevent working men from drinking, okay, as like a natural consequence of any kind of political discussion? I don't think so. But for $4 million, it was no problem. And so for 13 years, alcohol went off the market as a fuel, as an industrial product, which used to compete with many oil products, and of course for drinking also. So alcohol has a long history, starting back during Prohibition, of fighting tooth and nail with the oil companies for what we should have as our national fuel supply. In other countries, it wasn't even an issue because oil tankers didn't exist until in large quantities until after World War II. So places like the Philippines and New Zealand ran their entire economies on alcohol, as did Brazil. They used nipa palm trees, which have these great big globes that produce like 3 quarts of sugar solution a day, which they would tap like maple sugar trees all into big tanks and ferment it and make alcohol. New Zealand used beets and other kinds of sugar crops. Probably the biggest in the early part of the century before World War II, that biggest, most organized alcohol economy was Germany. Germany had a huge cooperative alcohol fuel system where farmers would bring their potatoes in. They would get back 1/3 of the alcohol, the distillery would keep 2/3, and the farmer would get back all the mash, the leftover pulp after making the alcohol, which they would then feed to their pigs. You know, and so they got their animal feed back, and they got 1/3 of the alcohol, which they could sell or use in their farm, and then, you know, the cooperative distillery would sell the other 2/3. This was so effective that when it came to World War II, and immediately the Allies cut off Germany from having oil, didn't stop them for a minute. You know, they just continued their war effort, first running on alcohol and then later developing other synthetic fuels. But alcohol was really what kept World War II going for Germany. Same as was in Japan. Those Zeros that flew over to our country couldn't make it on gasoline. Not enough ability to climb, not enough distance. They had to run them on alcohol. We ran our torpedoes on alcohol during World War II because alcohol is tolerant of water, etc. So there's a long history of this stuff being used all over the world. And it only really changed after World War II. Now, you know, the importance of the Middle East to the oil supply was understood all during this period, this early period before World War II. This is a great quote that I found in an economic journal from England during that period. America is running through her stores of domestic oil and is obliged to look abroad for future reserves, which are very largely in British hands or are controlled by British capital, which refers to the Middle East, because the Middle East used to be under the British Empire. Before very long, America will have to come to us for the petroleum she needs. It will be within the limits of the commanding position that the future has in store for us to hold up the entire world to ransom in the distribution and price of this vital essential. So, you know, all the hand-wringing nowadays about, oh my God, we're suddenly dependent on the Middle East, we've understood this was going to happen since the 20s. And there's been certain reprieves over time as big reserves were found, but basically everyone has always known that the Middle East is where most of the oil is, even in 1919. So we're talking about a really ongoing battle between farmers and basically handful of large corporations controlling the fuel supply in this country. And over again, we find throughout the history of fuel in this country, incredible, sophisticated propaganda campaigns to keep alcohol off the map and basically manipulate public opinion. And probably if I asked, and I will ask right now, what are some of the things you've heard about alcohol fuel? And we can list some of those myths right now. I can probably tell you where they all came from.
Well, if we use ethanol, then we're going to be using up our topsoil to grow corn so that we can run our cars, so.
Okay, so it uses up or damages our soil, which is theoretically unethical to take, our valuable soil and turn it into fuel. What else have we heard?
Corrodes aluminum, ethanol corrodes. Yeah.
Corrodes metals, and also in that myth is also rubber and all kinds of car parts are supposedly damaged by alcohol. Any other myths?
I don't have a myth, but I consider myself fairly well educated, and yet, all of what you're saying is pretty new to me. And so I guess I grew up thinking that there was no alternative. So talk about brainwashing. I mean, is there something that happened in the educational system?
Well, it's nothing that doesn't happen normally under capitalism. It's just you're getting woke up to this particular hydra head of it.
What about, is it possible that that there is a long-term economic downside to alcohol?
Is it economically sustainable? And of course, that's, that you've heard this actually in the last few weeks in the debate over the energy bill in the Senate. They basically say that alcohol is completely unsustainable economically. It's only a way to make Midwest farmers rich at the expense of American taxpayers subsidizing alcohol fuel. Otherwise, it couldn't survive in the market. We'll talk about that.
What about all the people who are going to drink it?
Boy, I've got a cartoon in here.
Alcohol station, and they're going to.
Boy, that's a great one. Back right after the Prohibition and alcohol was back out again, the oil companies were enforced with propaganda. They had these great photos, or I should say great cartoons, political cartoons that said every gas station would be a speakeasy. Of course, alcohol is, I'll explain why that isn't a case, why it doesn't happen. There's actually the biggest myth which nobody's mentioned yet, and you'll all say, oh, I've heard this as soon as I say it, which is that using alcohol actually uses more oil because it takes more petroleum to produce alcohol than you get back in the alcohol. All the energy of farming, all the energy of transportation, all that stuff actually uses more energy than you get out. This is a hugely promoted myth, the energy balance question. So we'll definitely debunk these and explain how what's going on with these, because they come up even today. For instance, this one here, we haven't heard about the corrosion issue in the United States for a long time because we debunked those back in the 80s, but now it's like no one's ever said it in Australia. They're talking about how alcohol will wreck the cars, just like it was 1980 in the United States.
Well, if you don't address conservation, it seems like the sustainability of anything we do is really a question, because we just can't replace oil wells with monoculture, corn, or whatever it is, because we consume too much.
I'm in total agreement with you, and we'll address that. And there's no doubt that, there's no disputing that we have to use less energy, period. That's absolutely true. So part of the question you're asking is, can this produce enough energy in a way that doesn't cause negative ecological consequences? And we'll cover that.
I thought part of conversion was having to go to stainless steel, though, because of the corrosion issue.
Well, let me launch into it, and we'll start catching up on these detailed questions. First of all, let's talk about how alcohol is even produced. Alcohol is liquid solar energy. So let me explain to me how we get there. Alcohol is a product of carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates, carbon, and hydrate is water. So we make carbohydrates, which typically are sugar in plants, starch, and cellulose. Those are all carbohydrates. Now, to make a carbohydrate, what a plant does with photosynthesis is it takes carbon dioxide from the air, water, and through photosynthesis, using the energy from sunlight, combines those two to make sugars, starches, and cellulose. It always makes sugar first. All three of these carbohydrates start off as sugar. Starch is a chain of 6 sugars together. And cellulose are many chains wound together in crystals. So cellulose, because of this wonderful, fibrous structure, are the basic plant material that holds plants up. But, and so, so it's also very resistant to decomposition in general, except for, bacteria and funguses that break it down. And, those of us, for instance, who would like to get food value out of cellulose would find that that fiber is really good for a lot of things in our health, but not for energy, because we don't digest cellulose. We don't have the enzymes to break apart those crystalline chains, but we do have the enzymes to break down starch. In fact, we have one of the main enzymes right in our saliva. If you take a saltine cracker and you chew it for a while, and you just keep chewing it and keep chewing it, you'll all of a sudden notice it'll get sweeter and sweeter and sweeter as the starch breaks down into sugar. So in making alcohol from grains or starchy materials like potatoes of course are made into vodka, starch is broken down using enzymes into sugar, and then we go ahead and feed the sugar to yeast, the same yeast that make wine or beer, basically. Now, what the yeast do is they take that sugar, they absorb it, digest it, and they produce alcohol as basically yeast piss. It's an excrement from the yeast, and they breathe out, because yeast are not exactly animals, but they have a metabolism which allows them to take in the sugar, and they breathe out carbon dioxide. So half the sugar that yeast eat becomes CO2, and half becomes alcohol. Now, these are the same yeast that make bread. So the whole process of making bread rise is taking advantage of the carbon dioxide side of yeast metabolism. The carbon dioxide they breathe out make the bubbles that make bread rise. Now, of course, half the sugar in bread also turns into alcohol. So when you cook the bread, the alcohol is driven off. And in Sweden, all bakeries have to have a condenser on the top of the oven flues to recapture the alcohol, where they then use it in the gasoline. So they're saying, why put the alcohol in the air where it's a pollutant? It's an organic chemical. Although it's not severely toxic, since we can drink it and, get away with that pretty well. It is something you don't necessarily want to add to the air, and it's a valuable product to recover. So in Sweden, it's all recovered and put into the fuel. So we've been using yeast a long time as human beings to make different things for us. And so alcohol is one of them. So the process is basically making a funky wine, which we then distill into a funky whiskey, which we then put in our cars. Typically, alcohol should be about 80% pure minimum, although it's much less technical problems if it's at least 90% pure. And it's possible to make alcohol completely pure or 200 proof with a couple of steps. So alcohol is... So when we go ahead and burn it in the car, out the exhaust pipe will have the same things that went in, CO2 and water. And the solar energy released when the alcohol explodes in the engine is what drives you down the road. So it's liquid solar energy. It's what's left over, it's what the plant used in terms of energy to join those chemicals together. And then when we burn it, we release the carbon dioxide and water back to the air for use by next year's crops. And the energy drives us down the road. So is it sustainable? Well, we could probably do it for 4 or 5 billion years, which is about the time they expect the sun to burn out, in which case we have other problems at that point. So, we can make the alcohol forever. You'll notice that nothing from the soil ends up in the alcohol. Nothing from the soil ends up in the alcohol. So the alcohol production itself does not deplete the soil. Now, we have to be careful about our agricultural practices and how we go about producing it, which I'll get into in a little bit, because there's some very good implications for breaking monoculture using alcohol fuel production. Questions so far? And feel free to ask them all during the talk.
So the CO2 is going into the atmosphere?
Correct. Now, that already sets off flags for everybody, right? CO2 going back into the air, because we don't want CO2 in the air. CO2 is what causes...
Well, except that the corn plants that are planted to produce more are going to pull that CO2 out and spit oxygen back out, right? So
Absolutely.
Exactly, that's right.
Well, yeah, and the CO2 came from the air in the first place.
Correct. So you guys have already jumped ahead, and what you're seeing is that on the surface, what's obvious is that it would seem that alcohol production is carbon neutral. In other words, the carbon dioxide that's released is exactly the same as what's absorbed by next year's crops. Now, the oil companies, when they go ahead and talk about CO2 from alcohol, they neglect to mention the back half of the cycle. They say alcohol puts out 20 pounds of CO2 and gasoline only puts out 21. There's hardly any savings. And they totally ignore the fact that it gets absorbed by the next cycle. So this is the kind of propaganda that we're constantly having to deal with. But actually I'm going to show you ecologically, because I'm an ecologist and a biosystematist, I tend to draw the box a little wider. So I'm going to give you a little education here about plants, which you might not know. So we got a corn plant, okay? So the corn plant takes in CO2, it takes in water from the soil, and it makes sugar and starch and cellulose. The plant is largely made of cellulose. Now we, of course, are using the grain to make alcohol fuel currently. We're not using the rest of the corn plant yet, but I'll get there. I'll talk about that. So for every 1 pound of corn, we get 2.5 pounds of stalk. So corn is really inefficient as a crop in general. For instance, wheat, if you grow 1 pound of wheat, it's only 1 pound of stalk. So the plant is very efficient at making food compared to just plant structure. Corn is very inefficient.
It also takes a lot out of the soil.
And it takes a lot out of the soil because it's a grass, it's a high nitrogen feeder. Now, let's talk right now about the carbon dioxide part of this, and then we'll go off into the other things about agriculture and alcohol. So when these plants go to make alcohol, we're only taking it from the corn. And that part, just the corn part, is neutral carbon. The amount of alcohol that is, the carbon dioxide from that alcohol and from fermentation is the same amount as used to produce that corn next year. But when the plant is growing, it also makes 2.5 pounds of basically cellulose. So by growing crops to produce alcohol, the plant uses a lot more CO2 than is in the product that we make the alcohol from. So we're impounding a bunch of CO2 in the stalks. Now, and I've talked with people at the USDA about that, and they're able to understand this far. But they're not used to thinking in terms of whole systems, and in permaculture we do. So let's look at what's invisible. We've got all this down here. And what you may not know about most plants, including trees, is that for every pound of biomass above the ground, there's a pound below the ground. So when you see a tree out there, you're seeing half the tree. There's an enormous amount of life going on under the ground. In the case of grasses, it's actually more than half, but we'll just stick with half for now. So to make this 1 pound of corn, which is made into alcohol, we also get another, say, 2.5 pounds of root matter, which is all basically made from carbon dioxide and water. It's carbohydrates, it's cellulose primarily. Now, as an ecologist, I have to say that's not the end of the story. Because what most people think in terms of plants is that it's this one-way street. Nutrients go into the plant, and they go on up into the stalk, and they become part of the food. And we've been taught that this is basically the role of plants in the world is to feed us and feed other animals, and that the nutrient flow is all one way right up into the plant. Roots suck up nutrients, make the plant. But what most people need to understand about plants is that it's more complex than that. What's going on down here in the soil is a whole world in itself. And I spend about 4 hours talking about the soil in a permaculture class, so I'm going to give you just a little snapshot here. If you've got a root hair like this is microscopic now, okay? You got these little cell walls here. So this is the very tip of a microscopic root hair. Roots basically function as sponges. So it's like, for instance, let's say you have a spill on the counter, and you take a sponge and you push it down in the liquid on the counter and you let go. you'll see what happens. The fluid that's closest to the sponge sucks into the sponge, and then as you get farther and farther away from the sponge, there's less and less effect. So that's basically, the absorption from roots is very limited to what's right around the root, and that's the liquid with, nutrients that the corn needs. If that was the only way that the corn plant could bring in nutrients, it wouldn't get any taller than about this. And trees don't get any taller than about 8 to 10 feet before they fall over and die. Something else brings the nutrients to the tree or the corn, and those are mycorrhizal fungi. So these little fungi are much smaller than a little thread off through the soil. And as it comes up to the root hair, it either punches right in here, or it might punch right in there, and it will either grow into the space between the cells where there's fluid, or it grows right into the cell like this. So this fungus grows in there, and it takes fluid from the plant. What's in the fluid? Carbohydrates, sugar. So what you're finding is that it's not one way. The sugar is produced up here. It is pumped down into the roots, out into these funguses. It also gets exuded all around out in here, where it feeds bacteria. And the bacteria reproduce, and they break down other things in the soil, making them soluble, which then the plant can absorb. But most of it goes to these funguses. These funguses are called mycorrhizal fungi. Myco means fungus, rhiza means root. And these are not plants. Funguses are not plants. What can plants do? They can photosynthesize. They can make food from sunlight, right? Funguses don't do that. They digest things. They break them down. So what these funguses are doing is they're trading the sugar that the plant can just throw away, give away, it makes so much of, and get valuable nutrients that the fungus says, I can just dissolve this stuff and give it to the plant. Both of them are saying, we're getting away with something here, So this is, symbiosis, of course, both things giving each other what they need. It turns out that plants take 60% of their carbon and pump it out into the roots and out into the funguses. So now we're looking at just rough numbers. Another 5 pounds of CO2 is pumped out into the underground system where it goes into the funguses, etc. So for every pound of corn that we're turning into fuel, we're really impounding about 10 pounds of carbon dioxide. And this is not the best crop for doing this. Corn is, kind of a very wimpy crop when it comes to this whole ecological system of food production. So the simple answer is, it's carbon neutral when you only look at the grain, but when you look at the whole system, basically growing crops to produce our fuel suck tremendous amounts of CO2 out of the air and put it down in the ground, for microorganisms to eat. Because all this rots, when you turn it into the soil, etc. Now, eventually, those organisms will breathe some of that back as carbon dioxide, but it's a huge amount of reduction from the air. Trees are bigger, so they handle quite a bit more carbon dioxide, And there's a lot of trees, especially in the tropics. Remember I mentioned sago palms, for instance? There are trees we can use for producing alcohol as well. They just pump out the sugar, that are just great. But we're also going to talk about cellulose in a while, and that's where trees really can make a big difference. Just give you an example about when you get away from grain, when you go to the sugar crops. So let's say we're going to look at a sugar beet, okay? So you see all these great greens above the ground, but of course most of the beet is below the ground, right? Now sugar beets, most of you have never seen one. A sugar beet can be 15 pounds, and fodder beets even bigger. So the beet that's underground here, you would think, wow, there's 15 pounds of basically sugar, and a very small amount of weight is in the leaves. So this plant is much better at taking sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water and making sugar compared to a corn crop which uses a lot of energy to take the sugar and build it up into starch. It's less efficient for making sugar. But what most people don't realize about beets is that the taproot of the beet goes down 5 feet and that the root profile looks like this underground. These are all side roots going out. And of course, we harvest this main big root in the middle, but all of this is part of the biomass of the beet plant. So compared to corn, maybe double or triple the amount of carbon gets put into the soil, into the soil microlife, and of course is taken out of the air. So when we start growing stuff to make alcohol, we're doing significant reduction of CO2.
Is there a reason why corn is used instead of wheats to make ethanol?
We have a lot of it. The reason why corn is being used right now is that there's a surplus of it. And so it's a tail wagging the dog. Right now, alcohol production has developed as a way of using surplus from corn rather than thinking of it as the main reason for farming is to produce energy. And you'll see why we're going to turn that paradigm on its head. But right now, that's what's getting alcohol out there, is trying to do something with something that is so surplus and it's being sold for so little that if a farmer wants to make a middle-class living, he has to literally farm 1,000 acres in the Midwest. You're talking about a net profit per acre of $50 on a whole acre of corn. So with this incredible surplus of corn, which is engineered by government policy, primarily because corporations want to feed corn to cattle. And we're going to get into that in a little bit because this all ties in. So let's tell you a little bit about making alcohol and the carbon dioxide issue. Get back here and see where we want to go. Where do I want to go next with this? Now, making alcohol is really mankind's second oldest profession. We're talking about something that is low tech. We really understand how to do this. It doesn't take really sophisticated equipment to pull it off. Basically, making wine has been something we've been doing forever, and making distilled spirits, even the Greeks did that. So we're not talking about anything that is patentable. There's nothing proprietary. There's nothing high-tech that someone can latch onto and say, it's mine and you can't do it. Anyone can make alcohol. Questions?
I'm just wondering if you could also, with some of the things we're talking about farming, touch upon the whole bioengineered aspect of it.
I'm thinking where I want to do that, because there's a part of this where the work we're doing is intended to send Monsanto straight to hell. And let's do it now. Let's do it now. This is some of the work I'm doing right now, in fact, and it's something that's extremely exciting because it's great when you design an experiment and you go, I hope it works, and it works, So something, and it also points to the way of thinking about systems and the way of thinking about not only agriculture, but the way we approach ecological problems and economic problems. So we talked about when we make alcohol, we make CO2 as one of the byproducts, because remember, half the sugar the yeast breathe out is CO2, and we collect that. And we'll talk about why that's important. We make alcohol, and what part of the grain turns into alcohol? We've been talking about it all night. The sugar, starches, carbohydrates. So that means everything that's not a carbohydrate is not converted to alcohol, and it's there left over in the mash. And that leftover grain has all the proteins and fats and minerals and everything from the soil that became that grain of corn is there in the byproduct, which when it's dried, we call it dried distiller's grains. Okay, I'm going to talk about, this is used as an animal feed. Now, I'll get there in a little bit because we're going to talk about this Monsanto thing. Now, those are the main outputs from making alcohol. There's a few other things, but those are the big ones. Now, as an organic farmer, and in fact, maybe you can tell us about this, Diane, what do you use corn gluten meal for? Or what could you use it for? Not everybody uses it for that, but.
I don't know.
Okay. Not everybody does it. It's not totally well known, but corn gluten meal is a protein that is extracted from corn. And it's sold as an animal feed in Europe, but some organic farmers accidentally discovered some years ago that if you sprinkle it on the ground or turn it into the surface, it will stop weeds from sprouting for 3 or 4 months. I see a head shaking. So have you tried it? And it worked pretty good for you. Okay. Got to get the timing right. It's got to be right after you till, before the seeds have a chance to sprout. So corn gluten meal has been known about now for 7, 8, 10 years that you could do this, and some organic farmers for high-value crops use it. Now, this is only one small part of the corn, but it's in the dried distillers greens because we haven't taken the gluten out, it's there. So my question to myself was, can we use the dried distillers grains the same way that people use corn gluten meal? And I had a reason for thinking about this, which I'm going to wind us around to. So we did the experiment back at our office recently, and I'll tell you a quick story about this, which is so different than when I did this 20 years ago, is the fever about intellectual property that goes on nowadays. So I called the company and asked them for a couple of sacks of this stuff so that I could test it. And they go, what are you going to do with it? Well, I got this experiment I want to run. And I told them about it, and they go, well, could we buy rights on that? Could we like hold that up for a couple of years and see how you come out? I go, I haven't done the experiment yet. And you want to buy rights to it, and I've only got a hypothesis.
You give your .com?
What's that?
That's the .com story.
Well, but this is a farming distribution company. So I said, fine, I'll give you first right of refusal if you'll write me a check. And they wrote me a check. I couldn't believe it. So I did this experiment, and what I found is that we went and got the seeds from the 10 most common weeds in corn, because I figured that's the toughest test. Because, obviously these weeds are exposed to corn, so they would be probably the most resistant weeds to this working. So let's try the toughest test we can. And also, if it works, there's a hell lot of corn grown, and that this could be used, in that case. So we tried it. And what we found is 5 out of the 10 weeds were outright killed by the stuff. And the other 5, 3 out of the 5, were really stunted. Now, if you're an organic farmer, you're really used to the whole concept of not being absolute about things. Like, you don't have to kill all the bugs. Sometimes you just need to, knock them back a little bit so your crops can get ahead, and then, it's past the stage where those bugs will bother you anymore. So it's a different approach than bug kill, which is the normal agricultural approach. So with weeds, we looked at this being the same thing. We were hoping that it was going to have this absolute herbicidal effect because, that's what everybody wants. But what we found is that the stunting was almost as important, because if you can knock down the speed of growth of the weeds, and as you all know, corn grows like, gangbusters, it'll shade out the weeds if they can't, get up to a place where they can poke through the corn. And this is what happened. So most of the weeds were either killed or stunted, so it worked. So this is exciting. I'll explain, as an permaculturist, how I think about this and came to this experimental design. As you've mentioned, a lot of corn is genetically modified. About 60 to 70% of it now is genetically modified seed. And the modification is almost always to make the seed Roundup ready. Now, Roundup ready means you can grow the corn and you can spray this herbicide known as Roundup right over the corn, and the corn doesn't get affected by the Roundup, but all the weeds underneath get killed. Now, to get this approved, Monsanto had to get the FDA to allow 4 times the amount of residual herbicide on the food, considered safe, but of course Monsanto was more than happy to volunteer the research time to determine that for the FDA, and so their data was used to increase this limit. So this is the kind of stuff that we should be concerned about. So now we've got the corn itself providing dried distillers grains, which appear to have this herbicidal effect. Now, it's got another effect too before I take you down that road, which is all we've taken out of this is the starch, right? So what did I say is left in that mash? Everything that came from the soil, which made the grain what it is there concentrated. And all we've taken is the solar part out. So what do you think might be a good use for this stuff? Fertilizer. In other words, everything the next crop needs is right there in concentrated form. So I just did the calculations on this yesterday. I got all the data for it. And I have found that if you take the corn and make it into dried distillers grains, it has about 10 to 15% more nutrients than the next crop needs. Where's it coming from? Where's the extra nutrients coming from?
The fact that it's more condensed.
That's physical, but where did they come from to get there? The microflora broke down organic matter, metabolized it into proteins, etc., nitrogen, put it into the grain. So now, here's an interesting thing. If we put this back on the field instead of chemical fertilizer, fertility goes up 10% a year until it gets to a plateau.
How does that affect the microflora?
It greatly increases them. This stuff is incredible. That's what we did with our test, is we watched the bloom of microflora, and that's actually, it's a biological effect. They got rid of these weeds. It wasn't a chemical effect. So all the explosion of what would normally be like compost organisms and others that eat and break down cellulose and seed were eating the root tips of all the weeds is what it was. So it's just, we had a hugely powerful micro life that was just doing the job for us. Okay, so I'm bringing it all together for you now, right? Now we've got the fertilizer for next year's crop. We now have herbicide, okay? Now, when you're a corn farmer, you put in $150 worth of inputs, and you get out, if in a good year, $200 to, when you sell the corn. So you only get $50 net profit. Out of that 150, about 100 of it is fertilizer and herbicides. So now, we take the dried distillers grains from this process, and I got to tell you that the farm alcohol co-ops that are being operated in the United States, nobody's more than 10 miles from the plant because transportation costs start to get high, and it's better to build another alcohol plant than ship it from farther. So shipping this stuff back out to the farm is a piece of cake, and in fact, it can be done at the backhaul from bringing the grain in, during certain seasons. At any rate, we go ahead and put this back in the field, we till it in. We get, oh, by the way, it has no effect on the corn germination. Corn comes right up through it. And I've got great pictures, too, of how beautiful and green the corn is when it's grown with dried distillers grain. So anyway, I can tell I'm a little excited about this. So here we go. We've got a material that the farmer owns, because it's the farm co-op that's making the alcohol, that he can put back on his own field and not need herbicides, not need fertilizer, and although I haven't tested and proven this yet, as an organic farmer and a soil ecologist, I can tell you, you're going to see huge reduction in pest problems because of the health of the soil stimulating the plant. So you probably even see a slight further drop in cutting the pesticide cost, although I can't prove that yet. And the farmer now, instead of only making $50, will make something like $100 to $150. And this is damn close to organic farming.
It should go up each year instead of
And,
land improvement.
and the yield could go up each year as fertility goes up. So now, if the farmers don't need the herbicide, what do they also don't need? They don't need Roundup Ready seed. And they don't need Roundup Ready. They don't need Roundup. And Monsanto can go straight to hell because 2/3 of its profits come from Roundup.
So are you gonna come up with a lobby that's got as much money as Monsanto so that you can?
I got better than that. I got this huge corporation that wants to pay me to patent this and market the shit out of it. Much better to harness the engines of capitalism against capitalism than try to fight it yourself.
So how, one worry I have, which maybe you've addressed, but I want to make sure. Here in our area, a wonderful, awful thing is happening, which is that wine has become a very lucrative crop on land that was otherwise not used. And now a tremendous amount of agricultural land has been created because wine crops have become, vineyards have become so popular.
Don't worry about it.
So are we going to have acres and acres more of corn taking up?
That's a good question. Let me address your grape thing and relieve your worries. Last year, if you didn't have a contract for your grapes, instead of getting $2,000 a ton, you got $200 a ton. And there's something like 5 years worth of vines yet to start producing in a peak way. So you've got a glut now of grapes, and they're going to start ripping them out all over the state. So we've already hit the max. It's not going to get worse. It's going to start backing up. Not that it's so good right now, but at least don't worry about it being a cancer that will have a lot of impetus to keep spreading.
My wonder is if we're going to fuel the
A nation.
nation's cars on agriculture, will we take up all our wild land in order to do it?
Great question. Now, corn produces about 200 gallons per acre. And quite frankly, as a solar product, this sucks. This is like nothing like what we can get from the amount of solar energy hitting that field. So the book, goes into 40 different crops for different climates that are good energy crops compared to corn. And I'm going to get around to why corn is even grown in a minute, but let's look at some of the alternatives. And this is very exciting from a getting rid of the monoculture point of view, because if there's other valuable crops to grow, farmers can make more money. Although they're conservative and resistant to change in general, there's nothing like a good bottom line to get the discussion going. We never used to grow soybeans in this country, and when soybeans got introduced, it was only 5 years till it was 40% of all the farmland in the United States. So when farmers catch on to something, it goes. So 200 gallons per acre. Now, in different climates, different things are better for making alcohol. If you're down in Louisiana, or if you're in Florida, or even Southern California, there's new kinds of sugar cane, which will yield 1,800 gallons per acre. There's sugar beets, which will grow all the way up to Canada and into Canada, and also what we call fodder beets, which are slightly different, which will yield up around 1,300 plus gallons per acre. Now, I did some work 20 years ago with Dave Hull and Steve Wilbur up at the Arcata Marsh Project. Everybody here know what that is? It's the sewage treatment for Arcata. They use cattails, as the basic idea to take all the nutrients out of the secondary sewage and suck all those nutrients up into the cattails so that the water coming out at the end of the marsh is cleaner than the water coming out of the streams, out of the national forest. Because cattails are these incredible biofilters. They'll just suck up all the nutrients. Now, we did, and this was back 20 years ago when they were just getting the growing of those down, we calculated that we could do 2,500 gallons per acre, and that was only on two cuttings a year, 2 crops a year. You can get up to 4 in a warm climate like California, cattails. Indians used to use the bases of cattails, because they're almost pure starch, to make bread. So cattails are extremely efficient photosynthesizers, and they are practically hydroponic because of the way they grow in a nutrient solution. So somebody asked about municipalities. Well, every municipality has, see, in permaculture, I should back up and say we never say that there's a waste. Waste is not the right word. We say that there are surpluses that are not properly directed, So, cities and small towns have all this sewage, which is really an incredible resource, which is surplus usually. And so now we're talking about the kind of economic benefit from operating the sewage treatment in a biological way that could power all the city vehicles and get rid of the need to buy petroleum on a city basis. This integrates well with laws, which I'll explain later. There are many other crops that fit in this. Fodder beets, by the way, in fact, in Europe in general, they don't feed grain very much to especially their dairy cattle in the winter. They feed beets. They have huge, partially underground buildings where they stack up the beets and they feed the beets all winter to the cattle. They get way more milk than we get, from grain. I'll get to why grain is happening, because the more you hear about it, you go, why are we growing grain? Everybody else does something different. It's not a good reason. So there's many other crops. Jerusalem artichokes. I've got a cold. I can't spell when I have a cold. Jerusalem artichokes, which have nothing to do with Jerusalem or artichokes. They're a sunflower plant native to the United States, have no pests that have ever been detected. They produce a huge amount of carbohydrate in tubers below the ground, and those tubers are a carbohydrate called inulin, not insulin, but inulin, which nowadays, for the first time, we have cheap enzymes to break down into sugar, and we can go ahead and make alcohol from those. Jerusalem artichokes can do about 1,600 gallons per acre. So we have a lot of different choices. You get out to, you get out in Texas, you can grow pimelons, or buffalo gourds, which are these desert plants that need almost no water, and they make these huge fruits that are full of carbohydrate and seeds. You can make biodiesel and alcohol from them. The oil can be made into biodiesel, and the carbohydrate can make 700-800 gallons per acre. So in some places you can get 2 crops a year. There's a project going in Southern California which is going to grow 1 crop of sugar cane in the summer, and it's going to grow beets in the winter, and they're going to get over 2,000 gallons per acre. So the reason why I bring all these alternative crops up, if you're a co-op in Indiana and you've been growing corn forever and you finally built your alcohol plant, which they've done, and you're making money on the alcohol and you're selling a little bit of money for the carbon dioxide and the dry distillers grades, at some point you're going to realize that you're not a corn grower, you're an energy producer. And you're going to say, gee, is there something other than corn I should be running through this plant? And farmers need to be educated about what the economic alternatives are.
But with these other crops, are there still those benefits, like you're saying the natural?
Oh, herbicides? I have no idea. And probably not because it's corn protein. But these crops also use a tiny amount of fertilizer compared to corn. They just don't need much. And they also have far less pests. The other thing about this is that change to the pest issue is that the minute you start growing a multiplicity of crops, the bugs get confused. Because monoculture, for those of you who maybe not have thought about this before, if you grow many square miles of corn and you're a corn borer, you are in heaven, okay? Because there's nothing but food as far as you can see, and you reproduce like crazy. But if you're out there and this field is corn and that's beets and that's sorghum and that's Jerusalem artichokes, you don't have the endless buffet that you otherwise would have, and the tendency for your population to get out of control drops dramatically, and the need to try to battle those bugs drops away as well. So one of our key strategies in organic farming is multiplicity of crops and crop rotation to keep the bugs guessing. And it works pretty well. It's worked forever until we started growing monoculture. So this, diversifying our energy crops also can break the stranglehold that the chemical companies have on farmers. Because without, massive monoculture, the need for pesticides drops to nothing. And believe me, if you're an oil company and you can sell pesticides for $80 a pound compared to selling gasoline for 15 cents a pound wholesale, you can bet the oil companies would rather sell pesticides. Okay? And in fact, when it comes to petroleum nowadays, this is going to sound very familiar to you. After they make everything that's valuable, that they call valuable, out of oil, plastics, drugs, pesticides, industrial chemicals, everything that's left over is dumped into the gasoline. So on any given day, there are 400 toxic chemicals in gasoline, and those will not necessarily be the same chemicals the next day. It's whatever's left over. So gasoline is the biggest toxic waste disposal system in the world, and it's in the open, and it's legal. They're able to use our cars to spew their toxic waste back into the air, and they make something like $2,500 from a barrel of oil from the other chemicals, and they make $100 from the gasoline. And they don't care if they made zero, because they get rid of all their toxic waste. So you've all been dealing with the issue of MTBE, right? We've all heard about this stuff. Finally, we got it outlawed in California. MTBE is only made at 3 or 4 refineries in the world, and it's not made. It's left over from another process. And because it's got some ether in it, so it's got some oxygen in it, they were able to force Congress to let them use that instead of alcohol to clean up emissions from gasoline. And basically, it was a byproduct they had no use for and was going to cost them a fortune to get rid of, and they dumped it in the gasoline. So finally, after 20-something years, we said, that stuff's toxic. And we're finally taking it out. But it's really a refinery byproduct. You got to realize all of gasoline is refinery byproduct. Okay, so you can see what this can start to do for agriculture. It becomes de facto organic. It reduces fertilizer, pesticides. It starts to make farmers energy self-sufficient. And you got to wonder why they grow corn at all right now. This is such an amazing thing that I'm going to do a little segue into it, and you can see why it's such a fragile system that we should be able to bust this down. Basically, meat sells for 60 cents a pound wholesale, roughly, in most times. It's up a little bit right now because the market was so bad that people killed so many of their cattle. Now there's a slight shortage of meat, so it's a little higher. But 60 cents a pound is what a farmer typically gets for feedlot beef. Now, there's 450,000 feedlots in the United States. Feedlots are small amounts of land where you bring the corn in and the cattle eat it and they fatten up on it. Now, I'll talk about why that's stupid in a minute, but let's talk about the economics. Basically, since it takes, and some of you may know this, how many pounds of corn does it take to make 1 pound of beef? 10 pounds. So if you're going to make corn, or if you're going to make beef for 60 cents and you want to make a profit, how cheap does the corn have to be? It takes 10 pounds to make that 60 cents worth of meat. About 5 cents a pound. 5 cents a pound. That's cheaper. It's cheaper to burn corn at that price in a stove than it is to burn firewood. Okay? What's that? Heaven forbid eat the corn directly. People don't do that. 70% of our corn is fed to cattle in the United States. 20% of the corn is fed to rich European cattle. Only 10% of it goes to other uses. Of that, 7% is alcohol, both whiskey and fuel. Then there's high fructose corn sweetener. And you're down to 1% or less is actually fed to people. And I don't think corn chips really qualify too much as food. Now, those of you who aren't vegetarians are going to say, now wait a minute, Dave. This is getting into the food versus fuel issue because meat is food. Well, you might have a point there. Being a vegetarian myself, I don't necessarily agree, but at any rate, meat is food, so we got to count that. So isn't it unethical, and this was back in that question earlier, to use our land and our soil to make fuel versus, making food for the starving hordes of India? Well, as we already found out, the starving hordes don't get any of this corn. But let's say we're talking about feeding our cattle with this corn. Well, it turns out that cattle, in permaculture, we always go back to where was it in nature before we messed with it. So does anybody know where cattle evolved from? The ecological center of where cattle came from? They started somewhere on the planet, so where was it? Close. Southern Europe and Northern Africa. Northern Africa used to be a forest. What is it now? It's the Sahara Desert. That's a desert human-caused by overgrazing. Okay, now, I'm not going to get into that whole story. That's for the permaculture course. But let me talk about cattle and what they eat and what they're evolved to eat and why what we're doing with corn is insane. Cattle have 4 stomachs. We don't, right? So why do cattle have 4 stomachs?
They can process it.
Process what? Cellulose, brush, woody stuff. Cattle are evolved, and if you look at their feet, they're not buffalo, right? What does a buffalo foot look like? What do goat's feet look like? Cloven hoof. Therefore, prairie living, traction on the prairie. Cattle have these big flat feet, right? What's that good for? Soft forest soil. Gives you more surface area for spongy soil. So you don't need traction. So cattle are evolved to live in forests eating brush. That's how they get their energy. So they've got an incredible array of organisms that live in their gut, bacteria that put out cellulase or enzymes that break down cellulose. And what does the cellulose break down into? Sugar, which they then are able to digest for energy, and that's what makes them live. So we come along and we feed a grass product to them. But these are forest animals. Corn is a grass. It's a big grass, but it's a grass. And when you feed grain to cattle, they don't have the enzymes to break down starch. So when you feed corn to cattle, 80% of the starch goes through undigested. So that's why in the Midwest they take cow poop from feedlots and feed it to the pigs, because there's so much food value left in it. So we are throwing the starch away in the way we do agriculture now. If we're considering, cattle agriculture food, we're throwing away 80% of the energy or the starch, and of course that causes tremendous problems in the feedlots because it's great food for bacteria and all the stuff that they wade through in the feedlots, but we're throwing away 80% of the starch. Now, this is really interesting because alcohol is a real big issue that can solve some of this, even if we're talking about keeping cattle agriculture for a while. If you take the corn and you first ferment it to make the alcohol, the starch is removed. What is left over, as I said, is the dried distiller's grains, and it's about 1/3 the weight of the original corn because the rest of it was starch and it disappeared. Now the cattle, when they eat the dried distiller's grains, don't have to fight with all the starch in their system, which makes them very ill, by the way. There's bloating problems and everything else when you feed them too much grain. So a very interesting thing happens. When you feed the 1/3 amount of dried distiller's grains in comparison to the 100% corn that you would have fed them otherwise, they gain 17% more weight, and they do it 13% faster, and they have less than half the vet bills. So this turns the paradigm on its head. The dried distiller's grains are not a byproduct of alcohol production. Alcohol is a byproduct of making superior animal feed.
You think McDonald's would be after them to do that? They could get their meat faster.
Well, but also think about some of the implications. That's getting close to 20%, right? So that's talking about freeing up, for the same amount of meat production, freeing up 20% of the land of the United States. You would need that much less land to feed the same number of cows. That's a huge number, really. So with dairy cattle, it's even more dramatic. Dairy cattle get up to 40% more milk when they feed dried distiller's grains versus normal corn, because there's a huge amount of wasted energy, biological energy that cattle go through trying to make milk from starch.
So why aren't the farmers doing this now? Is there
Oh, they are.
not enough of the BDG to offer them, or?
Oh, it's a standard commodity. It's right on the stock market every day. They trade in it. I mean, it's a huge product. This is done right now. What I'm trying to say is, wouldn't it be illegal, or shouldn't it be illegal, to ship this 20% grain overseas as corn when they're just going to feed it to their cattle? We should say, no, we're not going to let you go waste the starch. We're going to save that for our fuel, and we'll give you better animal feed for it, which only takes 1/3 the energy to ship it to you because we've kept the starch here. There's a lot of implications in this.
So this is a direction that sounds like it's actually happening
Oh, yeah.
on some level. And will probably, because it makes economic sense, it's going to probably evolve whether or not there is alcohol production.
Things that make sense don't always happen with the USDA. There's only one employee in all 64,000 USDA employees that deals with organic. So sense is really not what we're talking about here. Why do we, and by the way, if you're going to grass, like they do out here, Neiman Shell, other places, grass-fed beef is produced for 15 cents a pound. So it's even more economical to range feed beef. It would be more economical to run the cattle in the cornfield and let them eat the plants in place. What you need to understand is that different people make the money. If you're a corporation, you don't have to own hundreds of thousands of acres. You just have to own the feedlot. You get the farmers to grow the grain for you, ship it to your feedlot, you pump it through the cattle, and then you sell the meat. Now, if we were to do things in a way that made ecological sense for raising meat, in other words, let the cattle rotationally graze crops that are cellulosic, the people who would be making the money are the landowners, which are 675,000 farmers in the United States, and not a handful of corporations. 4 corporations control 80% of the beef in the United States. So the reason why we do this has nothing to do with making sense. It has everything to do with transnational and giant capitalism. Not about making sense.
Archer Daniels Midland.
Archer Daniels
What's to
Midland,
come?
Archer Daniels Midland doesn't even rank. Archer Daniels Midland is about 8th. You got Cargill, you got ConAgra, you got 2 or 3 other companies in the top, and Archer Daniels Midland's way down here. They get plastered a lot in the press because the oil companies want to see them go down because they're one of the biggest alcohol producers in the United States. They produce about 1/3 of the alcohol in the United States. Archer Daniels Midland runs their plant, their soybean plant, 3 months a year, processing nothing but organic soybeans. And they also run their corn plant several months a year, processing nothing but organic corn, not letting a single GM kernel into the door. Okay, so that Archer Daniels Midland has, I'm not going to say they're good guys. They're corporate bastards like the best, but they're doing some very interesting things, with their company that are looking at the organic market as something that they will serve and not fight against. They say, hey, we can make money there too, we're going to do it. They pay farmers 20 cents more a bushel than all the other companies for their corn because of their alcohol fuel production facility. So, I'm not a shill for Archer Daniels Midland, but being inside the business, I see certain companies doing things better than others, and they're actually a little better. I'll tell you something that leads into the rest of this. Archer Daniels Midland operates 10 acres of greenhouses. Now, what they're doing with these greenhouses is pretty big scale, but all of it scales down to the farm scale. They have 5 acres of lettuce production, lettuce and cucumber production. And it's completely pesticide-free. The way they do it is that they are taking the carbon dioxide from the fermentation facility and they're putting it into the greenhouse, and they're getting a full-size head of lettuce in 30 days. Because plants are limited in their growth by the amount of CO2 in the air. And in a greenhouse, you can enrich the air with CO2. And of course, if you enrich it enough periodically, what can't live there? The bugs. So it's organic pest control. And during the periods where they don't want that to happen, they have a whole IPM program using two insects that they go ahead and control all the bugs in the greenhouses. They use no pesticides. They don't label it as organic because all their fertilizer isn't organic. So they do this on 10 acres, and quite frankly, in some years, they make more money in these greenhouses than they do from their entire high fructose corn syrup plant. Because they're doing 50,000 heads a month of lettuce. They get 55 cucumbers, English cucumbers, per plant in this enriched environment. So the carbon dioxide, can be put to use when it's captured and not diffused into the air. And we can do that even on the small scale in a small greenhouse on a farm and make pretty good money with it. The other thing they do is they take the byproduct, the dried distiller's grains, and they raise tilapia with it. Now the tilapia, what's really interesting, fish, you get we said earlier, cattle, it's 10 pounds of food to 1 pound of meat. Fish, because they don't have a skeleton and have to fight gravity, 2 pounds of feed makes 1 pound of meat. So ecologically, fish are much better using this feed. And get this, Archer Daniels Midland delivers those fish live to restaurants all over the East Coast in tank trucks running on biodiesel. So what I'm trying to say is that they're not such a great corporation, but ecological thinking, because it makes economic sense, is infiltrating even Archer Daniels Midland. So you're seeing a little bit about the interaction between how alcohol can really change agriculture in a lot of ways that would go the way we want it to go. We haven't talked about, and we got to move on from that. I could talk about that all day, being an ex-farmer. But let's go on to some of the other subjects. We've talked about food versus fuel. Obviously, that's obviously a non-issue because we actually get more food, the way that system is now, than we would otherwise get. Cellulose is the next big frontier. Now cellulose, it costs about $1.62 to produce alcohol from cellulose right now, and from starch, It only costs about 90 cents. This is on the industrial scale. So right now, cellulose is considered uneconomical because it would make the price of auto fuel a little bit too high. This is only because gasoline's subsidies are buried in our income taxes. If you take a look at all the tax subsidies that oil companies get, and you start to include some of the obvious military subsidies, like for instance, you wouldn't get a single tanker out of the Gulf if it wasn't for $200 billion a year worth of naval presence. To move $60 billion worth of oil, that's a huge subsidy. In fact, most people studying this come up with figures of between $5 to $15 per gallon, not per barrel, per gallon subsidies out of our taxes to oil companies, depending on what you throw in, to what that means. So $5 is like way conservative. 15 is like when you consider, not even counting Iraq, just all the military expenditures, that go into to making oil happen. $5 is the current subsidy. Alcohol gets a small subsidy of about 53 cents a gallon right now. So with that, we can be competitive with starch-based alcohol, but cellulose is still a little high. But if you were looking, if it was an equal playing field and these guys didn't get this, any of these alternative fuels would be way cheaper than gasoline. But because they hide it in our income taxes, we don't see it. So cellulose right now is really tough stuff to break down. The way it's done commercially is you use sulfuric acid, you put it under pressure, the cellulose breaks down into sugar, and then you can ferment it. New ways of going about it are finding ways of taking the enzymes that used to be produced in the guts of termites and cellulases to break down the cellulose to sugar so we can make it into alcohol, and that has gotten suddenly cheap. The enzymes now are down. They used to be 50 cents per gallon of alcohol produced. They're down to a nickel now because the DOE had this competition which said whoever can get there first gets $15 million. And these companies all jumped in to see who could bring the cost of producing cellulase down. With that kind of incentive, they really did it. So as of last year, 2 companies now can produce the enzymes for 5 cents a gallon. Nobody's built a plant yet to use it, but when they do build those plants, we ought to be able to get in pretty close to the 90 cents. Why? Because out of the 90 cents, 75 cents is the cost of the corn. The rest of it is the production price. But when it comes to cellulose, there's no cost. It's just a collection cost. Do you know what the largest crop in the United States is by weight? It's not corn, it's not soybeans. Grass clippings. Grass clippings. We grow more biomass in our lawns and throw it away to the landfill than is produced in all of agriculture. Now there's a day I want to see people fighting over grass clippings to make alcohol with. But grass clippings are great because they're almost pure cellulose. Very little lignin, which is the resin binder that makes trees so woody and hard. Grass is all soft and floppy. It's almost pure cellulose. You can make great paper out of grass, for instance. It's very, very easy to pulp. So, we start making alcohol out of cellulose, we can produce, according to Barry Commoner, he did these figures back in 1982 for me, we could produce 150% of all of our fuel needs from cellulose if we start making a commitment to do it. I mean, we have that amount. So is it sustainable? Can we do it? You bet. When I worked on this question with Bucky had been looking at alcohol since, Christ, I think the 30s or 40s. Buckminster Fuller I'm referring to. He sat down and calculated how much energy we could get from photosynthesis without design. In other words, just looking at the biomass produced on the planet today, how much energy could we get from that? Because the oil guys are really good at saying, solar energy is so inefficient. Photosynthesis is only 1% efficient at taking solar energy and making carbohydrates. Well, that's a hell of a lot of solar energy. There's a lot of green matter. We could have enough energy from cellulose to power all of human activity, not just the cars, all our electricity, heat, everything, 15 times over every year. So why are we using this stuff that's running out that's in short supply? That's a political question. But from a technological point of view, if we design crops for energy production, not just the background cellulosic production. We can get tremendous yields per acre. I mean, for instance, the hemp guys are all talking about how there's 60 tons of cellulose per acre in all the stalk and leaf that's left over if you grew industrial hemp in this country. Well, that's 5,000 gallons of alcohol per acre, about 80 gallons a ton. So, yes.
And the seed is 18% protein.
Oh yeah, as a food, yeah.
It has the right ratio of omega-3s and 6s for humans.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons to grow that. But you may have noticed a similarity with that crop where it got demonized as a drug and then prohibited. Kind of like back during Prohibition where alcohol was demonized as a drug and prohibited. So they got the playbook right with alcohol and they repeated it for hemp. Took an industrial product off the market by focusing on its drug characteristics. So, things just keep happening over and over again. It's history again. So, and there's a lot of crops better than hemp in terms of cellulose production. Comfrey. Oh my God, the amount of biomass you get from comfrey, and it's, you can't, once you start growing it, you can't stop growing it, Every little piece of root will just resprout it. It just, it's a perennial crop. You can mow and mow and mow, So anyway, when we talk about the energy we could produce, it's pretty tremendous. Let me answer any questions from what we already talked about, and then I'll launch into stuff about the fuel and cars and laws and all of that good stuff. Any last questions from what we've already covered?
I was going to ask, what's the gas mileage compared to, or alcohol mileage compared to gas mileage?
Good. Well, we'll start right there then. If you look at all kinds of stuff written about alcohol fuel, the propaganda end of things, one of the things they always say is alcohol only has 63% of the heating value of gasoline, therefore it must get 30-something% less miles per gallon. And this gets picked up and repeated over and over and over until people are quoting each other and it's like it's some kind of fact. But in reality, this is again an oil company myth that's been promoted for many years. So let me explain why it's a myth and why it's not like that. As any good myth, there's always a kernel of truth that you build on and then you deceive from there. So it's true that alcohol only has about 65% of the heating value of gasoline. Now, what is the heating value? Because there's this inference that somehow heating value is equal to mileage. Heating value is what happens when you take a fuel, you burn it completely, and measure how much energy comes off it as heat. So if you were using alcohol to heat your house compared to gasoline, it's true you would only get 2/3 the heat that you would get from gasoline. But we're running cars, we're running internal combustion engines, and that's a completely different proposition. If heating value is all we cared about, then we'd want to run our cars on candle wax because it has twice the heating value of gasoline. But obviously it doesn't work very well as an auto fuel. In fact, diesel fuel has more heating value than gasoline, but you can't run your car on diesel fuel unless it's a diesel engine. So what goes on in an internal combustion engine is very different than heating value. There is a rough correspondence between the two, but it doesn't actually translate directly to mileage. How much mileage you're going to get on alcohol will depend on how you set up your car to run on it. If you do a real minimal conversion so that you're doing just what the Model A did, which was change the fuel air mixture, although on a modern car we do it a little differently than turning a knob on the dash, and you change the tuning, which is what the Spark Advance thing was all about, you'll probably lose about 10-12% miles per gallon, maybe even 15%. So obviously that's a lot less than 30-something%. There's a number of reasons why this is. First of all, as I pointed out, gasoline, especially modern gasoline, is really a dumping ground for a lot of stuff that comes out of oil refineries. Some of it will boil at 80 degrees, at room temperature. I mean, we all know how gasoline will, evaporate right at room temperature. But a whole lot of gasoline won't boil till 400 degrees. In other words, tars and gums and varnishes that are also being thrown away in the gasoline. So you get, depending on what's in the gas, you're going to get much different mileage than what it might be on another day. And of course, when they do these studies, they use indolene, which is reference gasoline, which is really perfect stuff. So when they compare it, they tend to get better mileage in these studies than if they use pump gas, which is really industrial waste products. So there's a certain amount of apples and oranges when it comes to doing the study. Now, when it burns in the engine, alcohol has a much wider range of flammability than gasoline does. Gasoline has a very narrow range in which if there's too much gas for a given amount of air, it doesn't run hardly at all. And if there's too little gas for a certain amount of air, it doesn't run very well at all. Alcohol will burn over a much wider range of ratios between air and fuel. So you can run alcohol at what we call a leaner mixture. In other words, less fuel for a given amount of air than the ideal. The ideal is called the stoichiometric mixture, the theoretical point at which every atom of fuel has an equal atom necessary of oxygen, so it all burns. But of course, that doesn't happen. That's why we have air pollution. If it worked perfectly, the only thing coming out of the tailpipe of a gasoline car would be carbon dioxide. Why doesn't it happen? Because when fuel goes into an engine, it goes in as particles. These are microscopic little particles. And when you go to burn them, at the outside of the particle, you've got a really good zone where the air or oxygen is very available to the fuel and it burns really well. As you get further into this little droplet of fuel, you get farther and farther from the available oxygen, and you get more and more unburned fuel or partially burned fuel byproducts. The hydrocarbons, for instance, that come out of your exhaust pipe in your test. So in theory, if you could get the particles small enough, you could get gasoline to burn really well. And some of the old-fashioned vaporizing carburetors, like the Nelson Pogue carburetor from Canada, actually, when you can get more fuel burning, you get better mileage. So the Pogue carburetor actually got 100 miles per gallon, back when cars were getting 10 or 15. The reason why is that it boiled the fuel completely to gas, so it was one molecule, not one particle, and it really burned well. Now, gasoline was made differently back then. It was by the skimming method, not the cracking method nowadays. So all the high boiling point junk that's in gasoline nowadays wasn't there when Pogue made his fantastic carburetor. So you couldn't do that nowadays. You couldn't easily vaporize gasoline to make that happen. But alcohol is really interesting. It boils at one temperature. It boils at about 173 degrees. So something we can do with alcohol, for instance, that's different than gasoline, is we can heat it up so that it's almost boiling when it goes into the engine, and then it takes very little additional engine energy from the warm engine to make it really evaporate more completely, and we get more complete burning. The other thing that's really important, that's different about alcohol, is that gasoline's a hydrocarbon, and what did I say is in alcohol? Oxygen. The reason why it gets less heating value is the remaining quantity is oxygen, and that's not counted as a fuel. It's consumed, so it's not counted as a fuel. But what it means is you've got oxygen in this particle. So the fuel burns more completely, and you get much better efficiency. So the average gasoline engine, and I want to back up and give you a little illustration here. If you came from Mars, and then this is an internal combustion engine, okay? Now, if you were from Mars and you looked at this thing and say, well, let's see, in this end goes fuel. And, well, what comes out of that fuel, 65% of the energy, becomes heat, which goes out through the radiator, through the engine oil, which is really hot, and is lost in friction. So those are the outputs, the main outputs from the fuel. Now, also about 25% of the fuel turns a shaft. In other words, does some work. So if you were a Martian and you looked at this machine, what would you say this machine was made for? Heating. This is a great heater. Okay? But for getting down the road, it's not very efficient. Most of this heat is the exhaust, friction of the exhaust, is unburned fuel. And some of it is, just because of the nature of internal combustion, some of it's going to be wasted no matter what. Now, alcohol burns very differently in a car than gasoline. When you burn the alcohol, it burns very completely, and less of the energy is wasted as heat. So what would be some of the things you'd expect to find then if it's having less heat, less waste heat? The engine runs cooler. And in fact, alcohol burns at about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, where gasoline is about 1350 and up. So the combustion temperature is much lower on alcohol because of the complete burning. Now, the other reason why this is cooler is a certain amount of the energy is converted, because it has hydrogen, oxygen, and this is true of gasoline too, by the way, but more so with alcohol, is a lot of this turns into water vapor. Now, if you take water, 1 unit of water, and you boil it into vapor, it expands a great deal. In fact, it expands 1,700 times. So 212 degree water compared to 212 degree steam takes up 1/1700th of the space of the steam. So that's called the latent heat of vaporization, or the phase change, where water goes from a liquid to a gas. And that expansion to a gas, for instance, is what powered steam engines. And of course, it has an effect on powering your car down the road. So alcohol produces more water than gasoline because of its chemical structure, and does it in a way that gives you some usable power and takes it away from the waste heat. So I'll give you some good examples of that. When I used to run my 53 Chevy on alcohol, basically we put a piece of cardboard in front of the radiator all winter because we didn't need any cooling at any time. In fact, once we did that, we took the fan off the vehicle. Now, fans back then, it's not so true anymore, fans back then took like 15 horsepower to run, and were a pretty good drag on your mileage. Nowadays, we have electric fans, so it uses a lot, so that difference is not as great. On motorcycles, I used to have a dirt bike, a 350 Honda dirt bike. I broke all the cooling fins off the motor because it was too cold otherwise. And if it gets too cold, the alcohol turns into bigger droplets of fuel and you don't get as good a mileage. So I broke all the cooling fins off because I didn't need them. That's how much cooler alcohol occurs. Now, of course, heat is one of your main engine fatigue issues. So lower temperatures in your engine make your engine last longer. Let's see.
There's one other thing, that is that the combustion chamber temperatures being lower knocks out nitrous oxide production.
Absolutely, absolutely. In the case, and we can go to emissions now. It's hard to get current statistics about how clean alcohol burns compared to modern cars. And I'm doing some translation now between the old studies and the new studies because no one's putting any money into testing it except in Brazil, where I'll be going soon to get some new data. But back in when we did this, and there was a lot of testing going on in the 80s, we were looking at 80 to 95% reduction in all categories of pollution. The 80% was in nitrous oxides, 95% was in carbon monoxide, which takes high temperatures to produce, and in hydrocarbons, which there are virtually none. So we were getting enormous reductions in pollution, and that was with car engines using carburetors that were not very efficient. Now, Gordon Cooper is you might remember him, he's the guy who was in that movie, The Right Stuff. He was an astronaut, hotshot aerospace engineer. He had some experiences when he was in the service where he had to get back for a launch because one of the other guys got sick, and he was at a rural airport where he had his Air Force jet, but he couldn't get any jet fuel on the weekend. So he called the local racetrack where they were using methanol to run a race that day for the funny cars, etc. And so he got a whole tank truck full of methanol and put it in the jet and said, what the hell, if I wreck it, I get back there, because he's a crazy man, So he goes up there and cranks it up and figured, well, I'll get to the next airport because, there's only half the heating value in methanol, which is the alcohol they used at the racetrack, than there was in the jet fuel. So if I can just get to the next airport, I can fill up. Well, this weird thing happened. As he started going up and up in elevation, his fuel consumption went down. And he was getting better mileage than he was getting normally, because as you go higher in elevation, there's less air. and less oxygen, and gasoline, or in this case turbine fuel, gets very inefficient. So he made it all the way back to Texas on 1 tank load of methanol. That got him all interested in alcohol. So when I was working with him in LA, he was trying to certify jet engines for alcohol in the 80s, and we were testing the emissions. And we had the emission probe sitting there in the exhaust, and none of the needles were moving. Well, dang, this thing's broken. We're looking at it, we're tapping it on the, it doesn't work, We set it down in front of the engine. We turn around and we're doing something else. And I turn back and I say, Gordon, it's not broken. We put the probe back behind the exhaust, no needles would move. The air from LA going into the turbine engine was dirtier than the air coming out of the turbine engine. We couldn't even measure emissions coming out of the thing. So by running alcohol in engines, you clean the air. So, and now you can see why. Because the lower temperature, especially with nitrous oxides, are strictly a product of high temperature. The more efficient burning. So instead of getting 25% of your fuel as work, several DOE studies showed, reliable, not laboratory, but in-field results of 38% efficiency, which is just really unheard of in internal combustion engines normally. And the way that was attained in this case was going further than the basic conversion. Alcohol is 106 octane, so this means it resists pinging. And some of you here are old enough to remember cars that pinged. Anybody remember pinging? You go up a hill and all of a sudden tap 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 tap. Well.
They still do.
Well, actually, most cars nowadays have a ping sensor, listens for inaudible pinging and adjusts the timing. So, it's not so common anymore. But back then, if you had cheap fuel, low octane fuel, you'd get pinging. Especially if you owned a car from the late 60s, because back then, gasoline was like 103 octane for premium, and regular was 93 or 94. So cars were made with what was called a high compression ratio. Now, a compression ratio, if you're looking at the inside of a cylinder of a car, looking at a cutaway of the cylinder, and you've got the piston down here with a connecting rod, and the piston goes up and down in the cylinder. The difference between when the piston is all the way down and when it's all the way up, the distance in that space is the compression ratio. So a lot of cars, especially in the bad old days of the early 80s, had like a 7 or 8 to 1 compression ratio, meaning that the amount of volume in the cylinder would be reduced to 1/8 of its volume when the piston went up. Now, if you went much higher than that, you got pinging or pre-ignition. Pre-ignition happens when you start squeezing the fuel, and of course there's the same amount of energy in the fuel, but the temperature goes up because you're compressing the energy in that atmosphere to a smaller space. Think about this room. Okay, it's like 80 degrees in here now, 75 degrees. If we took all of us and all the air in this room and squeezed us down to 1/8 of the volume, we'd have the same amount of energy. But now it's in a smaller space, the temperature climbs. So it might be hundreds of degrees. So in this case, you reach a point at which the fuel will explode on its own. And if it does that before the spark plug fires, that's pinging or pre-ignition. So that was really damaging to the engine because you get a shock wave going in 2 directions at once and you could cause holes in the piston, etc. So for cars not to have that happen, they had low compression because of the crappy quality of the gasoline. But race drivers have known forever that when you use alcohol, you can raise the compression ratio up to 12.5 to 1, or even as high as 14 or 15 to 1 on alcohol compared to gasoline. The higher the compression ratio, the more work you get out of the explosion in the fuel. So that's one of the main reasons why diesel engines are more efficient, getting more work for a given amount of fuel, and in some cases better mileage, because they have very high compression ratios. And in fact, diesel engines don't even have spark plugs. They use pinging as a way of actually running the engine. It compresses till it explodes on its own. And the way they control when it explodes primarily is how the fuel is formulated. So so with alcohol, if we want to go ahead and raise the compression, as is done in Brazil and many other places that make alcohol-specific engines, you can start to see mileages better than gasoline if you engineer directly for the alcohol. So in Brazil, simple conversions, the Model A conversion, just the air-fuel mixture and the spark advance, they have to be within 10% of gasoline, which of course all the gasoline guys say is impossible. It's supposed to be 30% less. But quite often they exceed gasoline's requirements when they use off the assembly line high compression alcohol engines in Brazil. Because in Brazil, they actually make engines specifically designed for alcohol. And the reason why they're able to do that, or were able to get that to happen in Brazil, is because they weren't a democracy when it happened. You see, the government of Brazil in the 70s was getting hit with really high prices for oil. And they said, well, we're going to go back to where we were just 20 years ago before World War II, 30 years ago before World War II, we're going to go ahead and start doing alcohol again. They went to the car companies and said, okay, you need to start making cars off the assembly line that are designed for alcohol. And the car companies all said, oh no, we'd have to retool everything. It's far too complex. You Brazilians don't know what you're talking about. You need to talk to us engineers. And the military dictators of Brazil said, read our lips. You want to sell cars here? They got to run on alcohol. I'll be darned if 3 months later they weren't making alcohol cars right off the assembly line for the same price as gasoline cars.
No, I'm sorry, who's they?
The auto companies.
In the United States?
Brazil. This is all in Brazil. Okay.
But what auto companies are there?
Ford, GM, Chrysler, Toyota, all the same ones.
Multinational companies with their offices in Brazil are right now able to, so that technology could pop right over here without any problem at all if they wanted it to.
It took, like I say, less than 3 months to put them off the assembly line. The government of Brazil, for the first time in 20 years, is going to let an American tour their program. They like what we're doing. So we're going to go down and document a whole enormous country that has to get rid of 100,000 barrels of oil a day, gasoline a day, because they're stuck with it, as they put it. They don't have a use for it. After they make everything else out of oil, this toxic waste product they sell to others because they are energy self-sufficient. And they've got a president there now, Lula, who is taking the alcohol program and bringing it back up to where it was early on. In the 80s and early 90s, Brazil was 80% running on alcohol. Now they're down to 1/4 of the vehicles run on alcohol because of drop in oil prices and oil company corruption with some of the past governments. But Lula is cranking the program right back up with the goal of not only making Brazil completely energy self-sufficient, but they're already exporting alcohol to Argentina, they're exporting alcohol to China, because China's figured out that we're not going to let them have any of that Caspian oil. And they're bypassing oil. They're going right to alcohol. They have the biggest alcohol plants in the world right now in China. The 2008 Olympics are going to be run on alcohol in China to show the rest of the world that oil is not king. But I'll tell you, cars right now are coming off our assembly lines in the United States able to run on alcohol. But I'm going to save that for a little bit. We'll get there. So you can convert a vehicle to do this. It costs some money to rebuild your engine to do this kind of thing. It could even cost $3,000 to $4,000 to make a high compression engine. But you would get much better mileage over the life of the vehicle. If you do that, you also get a tax credit, depending on the size of the vehicle, of up to $5,000 for converting your engine to alcohol. And the usual credit is $2,000 for, say, a large pickup truck. It would be $5,000. So you actually get back quite a bit of the money you would spend on conversion as a deduction. Sorry, it used to be a credit, now it's a deduction. So so that you get some of that back. But to do the simple conversion that we're talking about, which is changing the air-fuel mixture and the tuning and a few other little, like heating the fuel and a few other things like that, you can do that easily for $1,500 or less.
I have a question about a car that would run on alcohol in environments like somewhere in Alaska
Good question.
compared to California.
Real good question. And it gets to one thing about alcohol that's a negative compared to gasoline, which is it does not evaporate as well. Like, for instance, recently, I just won a battle with the California Air Resources Board that they were saying, well, because alcohol, as sold in California, has 15% gasoline in it, we regulate it as if it's gasoline because it's got a Reid vapor pressure, in other words, an evaporation rate over 4 pounds, and it's got petroleum products in it. So I wrote back to them and said, well, I'm going to run alcohol, and instead of gasoline being mixed with it, I'm going to mix 5% ether with it, which is made from alcohol. Ethyl ether is made from alcohol. So you can't regulate me. They sputtered and popped and wrote back to me and said, we can't regulate you. So that's a non-petroleum, completely non-petroleum fuel that will evaporate well enough to run in Alaska. So that's why right now alcohol sold at the pump in the Midwest has 15% gasoline in it to make it easy to start on a cold morning. Totally unnecessary. What you need to do is, to get the car started on alcohol, is provide for cold weather. So we've done that in a lot of different ways on the funky scale back in the 1980s. We would have a little lawnmower tank under the hood, a little pump to a push button on the dashboard, and a little squirter on the top of the air-fuel mixture, right on the top of the carburetor, and we'd give a little push, and it would give us a little squirt of, usually gasoline because it was cheap, and that would start the car. So anything that starts the car, it'll continue to run on alcohol just fine. So you need a little bit of something volatile to start the car. The other thing you can do, and we did this in the 80s also, is we drilled a hole in the body of the carburetor, and we put in basically a diesel glow plug. Now this is, in diesels, to get them started on cold mornings, you got to have a hot place where the mixture coming up will ignite. So what we did is we put that into the side of the carburetor, and you pushed it for 30 seconds. It heated up all the fuel in the carburetor and started it just fine. There are dozens of ways to do cold starting, but all of them required some hardware. And the car companies, as I'll be talking about, when they got forced to make cars that ran on alcohol, didn't want to add hardware. So they got it, the rule made that they could add require that the gasoline be added to the alcohol at 15%. 85% alcohol is still better than, no alcohol at all at the pump, but it's not the best plan.
Dave?
Yes.
To get back to Brazil for a second, how does one get a hold of a vehicle made in Brazil?
Can't do it. Can't do it right now because there's a huge amount of regulations that have to do with safety equipment, this, that, and the other thing. So it would take someone with a fair amount of capital to, to go ahead and refit those vehicles to fit U.S. standards. And that's not cheap, when you don't do it on the assembly line. So Brazil is actually toying with doing special U.S. runs of their vehicles right now because there's this huge upsurge in interest in alcohol, which you guys haven't heard about.
What, I was talking about Alaska, you're talking about the Midwest, but what temperature is it that you start to run into problems with the temperature?
In a fuel-injected car, which everyone has now, probably about 15 degrees. So around here it would never be an issue. But if you're in a carbureted car, down around 35, 40, you can start to run into hard starting. An older carbureted car. So you'd have to put a cold start device on, that's all. And that's, like I say, the cold start device there's commercially made ones, because diesels don't start on cold mornings. There's ones that have what looks like a little propane torch bottle, but it actually has ether in it. It goes, to the manifold. You pull a little lever on the dash, it gives a squirt, the car starts. That's like a $15 device, This is not a technological difficulty.
You're going to get around to OBD2 and California smog stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'll get there. Well, I'm going to try something I haven't done for 20 years. I'll see if I don't blow myself up in doing it. I'm going to burn a little bit of alcohol and gasoline to show you a little bit about the difference, really directly. In a few years ago, 15 years ago, you couldn't do what I'm doing here with gasoline, which is put it in a bowl and then light it. If you put it in a bowl and stood back 10 feet and lit a match, that would go off, because we had much more volatile gasoline 15 or 20 years ago. So that's gasoline, and that's alcohol. Now, there's 5% gasoline in the alcohol. That's why you can see a yellow flame at all. The reason why the gasoline is in there is because by law, you have to poison the alcohol so it's not drinkable. And the gasoline looks like it already burned up. Well, I didn't put much in, but you can already see the carbon that's coating the inside of this, because I only put a very tiny amount of gasoline in there. So I can hand it around if you want to look at it. Now, the alcohol is not causing any carbon, even with the 5% gasoline, but the difference between the gasoline and the alcohol is I can put it out with water. Alcohol goes out with water, and so that's why one of the reasons why they use it in races is if you have a car turn over and explode on the track, you can get out there with the water and put it right out. And a lot of you intuitively know this because when you go to a bar, you see people drinking alcohol and they're smoking. Well, not in California. And nothing explodes. So when alcohol gets below 100 proof or 50%, it cannot light on fire, much less explode. The flash point, the explosion point of gasoline is 45 degrees below zero. So if you've got 50 degrees below zero and you light a match in a room full of gasoline vapor, it won't blow up. But if it's over 45 degrees below zero, like 30 degrees below zero, no more room, okay? With alcohol, alcohol's flash point is close to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. In other words, room temperature, you know, and that's only pure alcohol, and alcohol has different characteristics in its vapor spread, so you have to really work to get that to explode. Gasoline, it'll leave a container, it'll creep along the floor till it finds a pilot light, and will light and explode all the way back. Alcohol is lighter than air when it evaporates, so you have to fill the whole room to the right fuel-air mixture to get an explosion. It's really safe compared to gasoline. I'm going to do something else here which is kind of fun. This is an ingenious, you know, just when I thought I knew everything there was to know about alcohol, these kids in Berkeley sat down with some epoxy and soda cans and made an alcohol stove that works really well. I just thought this was so ingenious. So I'll just get that going while we're talking. We'll put a little pot of tea on. But
What else would you use to poison it besides gasoline?
ether works really well. Ether is an anesthetic and it's a legal denaturant. This denaturing stuff, denaturing means making it poisonous so you can't drink it, is a requirement of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms people. So a lot of folks say, is it legal to make alcohol? Because the revenuers, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, will come out and bust you because you could be making liquor. So I got to tell you a quick story about this, which has to do with, you know, our power as citizens. Lance Crombie was this interesting farmer up there in Minnesota, and he started making alcohol with a little tiny still, and the ATF came in and busted him and took his still away and said, nobody can make alcohol. Now you got to realize, back in the 80s, you couldn't even make beer and wine legally. There were no microbrews, none of that existed yet. You couldn't even make your own beer or wine. The government bureaucracy was so rabid about the subject. Well, we took Lance's story, and I made a still, so did several other people, and we wrote about it in a couple of magazines because we found out that there was an experimental permit down at Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that the big distilleries would fill out when they didn't want to do the whole 250-page permit, just to do something experimental. So we said, there's an experimental permit. We can all apply for it. There's no reason why we can't. So we went ahead and applied for it and built a still, and we said, come and get us. And they said, we can't. The permit's legal. So we told everybody, but we want you to go through this extensive procedure and get a bond and, you know, this and that. And we said, we're not going to do it. And so we wrote about this, and 250,000 people also applied for the permit.
Wow, 250,000?
250,000 people applied for the permit, which brought the bureaucracy of the ATF to a grinding halt. And they realized that if they were going to have any idea who was making alcohol, they were going to have to make it free and easy, or nobody would fill out the permit. So they made it a one-page permit. I think it's still free, and you can make 10,000 gallons of fuel a year. But of course, you're supposed to put something in it to poison it, you know, so that you can't drink it. And I'm sure you'll all do that if you make your own alcohol. We can trust you to do that. Now, car stuff. Back when I first wrote this book, cars had these quaint devices called carburetors, you know, which were, you know, really a Rube Goldberg device to mix air and fuel. I had all these wonderful different circuits that handled what happened at an idle, what happened when you started to accelerate, what happened when it was really running, what happened when you slowed down, you know, and all these mechanical controls or vacuum operated controls made a carburetor work. It was a fairly complex little device, but it was understandable. You could take it apart in those days and you could really see all the parts. And what we had to do, for instance, to make them run on alcohol, is we'd have to drill out a couple of holes here and there where the fuel went through to make sure a little more fuel went through, and stuff like that. Well, now cars are fuel injected, so carburetors, except in the third world, are kind of a thing of the past. So fuel injection, I'm doing the research on it now. I don't have all the answers, but I'm getting close to having all the answers. What fuel injection has done is imitated everything a carburetor used to do, but it does it electronically. So what happens is, up to 50 or 60 times a second, each fuel injection will open and spray fuel into the engine directly instead of into the air. Actually, right into the valves at the engine. And how long it stays open at each pulse determines how much fuel is being delivered. And this is all done by a set of sensors that sense different engine conditions, and a computer does all this. This is actually very cool. It's not, it takes more understanding for a backyard mechanic to be able to handle that stuff, but basically it's a very accurate way of delivering fuel compared to carburetors. Now, it also tends to be resistant to your messing with it, because carburetors were endlessly adjustable and we could play with them in all kinds of ways. But this is America. Other than tax avoidance, cars are like our national sport. So people have worked out the technology to do many more variations in how to handle fuel air mixture and other engine controls with aftermarket devices than we ever had with carburetors. So you now can buy aftermarket computers that allow you to plug in a laptop to this aftermarket computer and have the whole condition of the engine, spark advance that we used to have to do with the distributor, all the engine conditions right there on your laptop. And one person drives while the other person uses the software and says, okay, a little more fuel, that's just about right, let's go on to the next step. And you, in an hour or two, now have your car running on alcohol pretty darn ideally by using this software and aftermarket computer. So I haven't personally done this yet, which I'm anxious to do this winter, because I've just, done the research and talking to the manufacturers and how it's supposed to work. And they do this for race cars, alcohol race cars, so they've used alcohol, but they haven't done it so much for street cars. They haven't thought about people wanting to do this. But there's no reason why it shouldn't be pretty simple. Now, the OBD2, this is where we get into some more complex stuff. Since '98, there are, see, is that burning well? Yes. Look at the wonderful flame that's coming out of this alcohol stove now. Okay. So, so what's happened since '98 is the EPA has gotten way into making sure that if your car departs from the regulation settings, it goes into a limp mode, which allows you to get back to the mechanic and requires you to get it fixed. So the computer is really fussy about just how far out of specs it can go before it will throw you off into limp mode, and it controls more things. Several of the aftermarket car computers, instead of replacing these OBD2 computers, add on to that computer and allow you to control the things you need to for alcohol fuel, and it's just fine. Now, here's the problem with that. It's just like the ATF giving us a lot of grief about making alcohol. The EPA says, you can't play with your car at all. We don't care if you're using alcohol and it's 80% cleaner. The law is the law and you can't play with the devices. We don't care about the air, it's the devices. So technically it's illegal for you to make your car, oh, it's coming along. So technically it's illegal for you to alter your car to run on alcohol even though it's 80% cleaner than the gasoline version. Luckily, there's only one point in the life of your car that you have to worry about that. And when is that? When you go get your smog test. So, just like most people tune up their car before the smog test, you'll go into your local alcohol mechanic. There are some in the room that might be your local alcohol mechanic. You plug the computer back in, you go back to the software and say, go back to gasoline settings, take your test, come back, plug it back in and go back to alcohol. So until we can make it legal, that would be the way you have to deal with it. Now, what is it going to take to make... California is additionally on this. CARB, California Air Resources Board, has an experimental permit. So we've sponsored a few people now to be in our research group to experiment with alcohol conversion. It's a one-page form and it's free. So CARB said, well, we didn't mean this. We meant car manufacturers. We said, fuck you. It doesn't say who can use it. We applied for it. We got it. And they've had to let us do it. But they're kind of curious. They want to see what we come up with. So, this is really kind of interesting. But otherwise, it's the same deal. You'd have to go get your smog test by going back and converting back. Unless you have a really nice smog guy who's going to ignore the extra devices and just look at your readings, which are always going to be in compliance. So
That won't work. They can't ignore anything.
Yeah.
Because OBD2 records anything that goes outside the normal set of specifications are reported, and now they're plugging in and interrogating the computer as part of the smog test.
Okay, so that's updated information. This is what we're actually in the middle of researching now, so I'm glad you fed that back. So, you're going to have to go back to gasoline temporarily to meet smog. But what does it take in California, which is recognized by the EPA, is that you have to go ahead and have a certified conversion kit. Now, we've looked into this. There's no fee to go ahead and have a certified conversion kit, but you do need to get an independent lab to do the emissions test on your kit. So if we do these kits, it takes about $3,000 in testing to get them certified. So one of our goals, once we have the book out and we're working on this, is to pull some grant money in and start with the 10 most common engines and get those certified, certified kits for alcohol fuel, because it's really, in the greater scheme of things, not going to be that expensive for us to do it. And that'll make it easy for everyone. But in the meantime, well, you'd have to go back to gas temporarily, even though that's dirtier than you've been running at for the other 2 years. So that's where the laws stand on that right now.
What about the dual fuel cars?
Okay, now, I've been saving this, but I'm glad you brought it up. You can buy a car right now from the dealer that does just like Model A Henry Ford's car did, or runs on both, but much more cool. The computer has multiple sets of data that it can refer to depending on how much alcohol is mixed with the gasoline. So at every 5% mixture of alcohol and gasoline, it has a different set of data to tell the engine what to do. So you can literally put on one day gasoline in the car, and on another day put alcohol in the car, and it can mix it in the tank, and there's an optical sensor that shines a light in on the fuel, and depending on the color that comes back, basically, it tells the car's computer how to run automatically without even thinking about it. These are called flexible fuel vehicles. You get a $2,000 tax deduction for buying one, and there are many models of many manufacturers that are made this way, and almost all the various SUVs come in a flexible fuel vehicle model. Now you're thinking, that's very progressive of the car companies. It's really good of them to do that work. And they've been doing it for 10 years. You've been able to buy these cars, and you've never heard of it. Most of them are sold to government fleets, which by law, 75% of them have to run dual fuel alcohol. So you can buy those cars. They don't cost any extra over the gasoline version, but primarily the sales are to government. They don't advertise them to you guys, but they're there.
American companies or Japanese?
Right now it's all American companies and a few Japanese companies, but not our favorite Japanese companies. And Mercedes-Benz does it. Isuzu is one of the Japanese companies that do it, but Toyota and Honda don't yet. So, we'd have to do an aftermarket conversion on those cars.
Can you run 100% alcohol in those cars?
Yeah, they work fine on 100% alcohol.
Keep filling up with alcohol and it won't follow the car.
Now, the thing is, they didn't put a lot of work into this. So they typically lose 15 or 20% miles because they haven't optimized them for alcohol.
They haven't changed the engine.
No, it's just that you can do it really well or you can do it to rule, work to rule. And what they did is let me back up and say why they're doing this. For every car that they make that runs dual fuel and alcohol, the sons of guns get to make a few more SUVs. So it's a way of buying pollution credits so that they can sell more SUVs. So that's why they're doing it, not because they think they want to be good citizens. So you would want to go ahead and even in those cases, probably mess with it in between smog checks to make it get better mileage. But you can use them just the way they are. And the nice thing about them is that you can put anything you want in them and go any distance, not worry if alcohol is available. Now, alcohol is available in many parts of the United States at the pump. There are 300 stations right now that have alcohol at the pump. Only one in California, down in San Diego, and a whole bunch of them have applications in now for other places in California. But, you know, this is a really small number of stations. There's 175,000 gasoline stations in the United States. What you often find is people put in their own tank and, you know, like let's say it's a fleet or it's a state fleet or whatever, they get a tank put in and they get alcohol delivered and they just do it there rather than have it at a station. Oh, well, we're getting boiling water here. That's pretty nice. Pretty good heat value there, you know. And it's simply made out of two aluminum cans and some epoxy. And it's, you know, if you put 4 or 5 of those together, it'd be just as hot as your stove at home. Now you can buy alcohol stoves, by the way. Anybody who's ever been on a sailboat knows this, because alcohol is the only safe fuel on a sailboat because it rises. Propane, you know, kerosene, etc., all go down into the bilges. So basically, alcohol stoves on the best sailboats are what you always find, you know, and so you can buy those commercially. They cost more than a normal stove because they're not as mass-produced, but they're beautiful stainless steel, you know, stoves that are used for boats. This is just the first funky one I've ever seen. Okay, I've got to tighten this up here. Yeah. Since 1983, pretty much all fuel components in modern automobiles are alcohol tolerant because that's when they started making gasohol. In other words, 10% alcohol with gasoline available all over the United States. So they required all the rubber parts. There were certain rubbers prior to 83 that would soften under alcohol. And there were certain platings in gas tanks that had a lot of zinc and lead, and those would dissolve in, you know, and especially in the case of methanol, which is a much more corrosive alcohol made from natural gas. But in the case of ethanol, some of that term plate would come off and plug your fuel filter, so they've gotten rid of that. But once it all came off, then you were fine. You know, so what the realistic protocol was, you'd go through 2 or 3 fuel filters in the first 1,000 miles, and then you'd be okay. But pretty much all modern cars are alcohol tolerant at this point and have been since '83. So the stories about how it'll wreck your car are pretty much unfounded. Now, if you make your own alcohol, you can have a high amount of acetic acid in it if you don't neutralize it with lime first before you distill. Acetic acid will eat aluminum and will eat zinc and a few other metals. So you want to make sure your pH or your acidity is neutral when you go to distill, and that's, you know, that's all in the book. It's all, you know, straightforward stuff if you're making your own fuel. What can you make your own fuel for? If you do it yourself, and you do it like I did, where you got, you know, waste materials, because remember I showed you that the big price in making corn alcohol was the corn. But I used to use things like, well, my favorite was old donuts, because cops can only eat so many, you know, and then they go to waste. And so one pickup truck full of donuts would make me 100 gallons of alcohol. You know, and what was nice about that is...
Got them from police stations?
No, they tend to get eaten there, but you know, the donut shops, once they're a day old, they throw them out. So I would leave drums at donut shops, and once a week pick them up. And what was fun about that is we go to cook the stuff, add enzymes to break it down into sugar. By the way, each donut has 10 teaspoons of added sugar. And of course, it's all white flour, so that all turns into sugar. But what else is in donuts? Fat. So when we go to cook the donuts up and break them down into sugar to ferment them in alcohol, we'd skim off the fat, which was like this deep on the top of the tank. You could make biodiesel with it, but what we did is we used it to fire the still. So we had no energy costs. We used the fat to be the energy cost to run the still. That was a lot of fun. But all kinds of things can be used to make alcohol as waste products as well. So when you're using a waste product, you can make alcohol for about 20 to 30 cents a gallon. And 3 or 4 cents of that is enzymes, a couple cents is energy, 5 or 6 cents is amortization of your still, you know, and it's really cheap. On the commercial scale, huge plants, very expensive, et cetera, using corn, they're making it for 90 cents a gallon wholesale, selling it for that wholesale. So they sell it for between 90 and 10. Now, when we first started this movement back in the 80s, it cost them $2.50 to make the alcohol. Because of the subsidies and the effort put into it, they've reduced that cost down below $1. And the price of corn has pretty much stayed the same over that whole time. Sugar crops tend to be less expensive than starch crops because they don't need enzyme breakdown. They're already sugar. So making it on the small scale, would work pretty well if you have a source of waste material. If you don't have that, then you look for materials that can be delivered. For instance, molasses is a waste product of the sugar industry. You can make alcohol on the small scale for about 80 cents a gallon using molasses. No enzymes needed, whatever. It's really quite simple. You're making rum is what you're doing, Now, it's pretty good to be making it for 40 cents a gallon. That feels, especially when they run it up to $2.35 or something. But that's going to end soon, this low price of gasoline. I'm just going to kind of quick tell you a little bit about peak oil. Back in the 80s, I wrote about all the world predictions for the actual amount of oil we had looked like we would peak around the year 2000. In fact, the Office of Technical Assessment of Congress said the same thing. So we've known this for a long time, but various people would say, oh, no, that's not true. The U.S. Geological Survey would say we have enough oil to 2050 before we peak. And of course, all the Arab countries reported these large deposits because the larger their deposit, the higher their quota was in OPEC. So we have all these inflated numbers. And only 2 months ago, a Swedish study came out saying that the world supply of oil has been overestimated by 80%. Okay? But that was never a secret to the industry or to people in government. We've known this for a long time. We know this because of M. King Hubbert. He, back in 1956, predicted that the United States would peak in oil production in 1970. And everybody said, you're smoking something. You're crazy. There's no way. We got 100 years worth of oil. Why are you making all this trouble? And he was a petrogeologist. He said, look, I've been looking at all the data, and this is what it's going to be. And they said, yeah. And they dismissed him. In July 1970, the United States peaked in oil production, which meant we no longer could produce as much as we needed. So, in other words, all the wells were running flat out after that point. Now, Hubbert also made a prediction about the world peak of oil. And he said that was going to happen sometime around the year 2000. But remember, he's making these predictions back in the 60s. His student, Kenneth DeFaze, has carried his work forward and has written a book called Hubbert's Peak, which came out a few years ago. And he said, taking the same analysis that Hubbert used and plugging in all the numbers up to current times, that oil would peak, depending on how hot economies were, between sometime mid-2003 and 2006. And now that's been further refined to, he says conservatively, early next year in 2004. It actually has already happened. And you've all watched it happen. A few months ago, OPEC cut back oil production 3%. Not exactly your big slash, but they're about a third of the oil production of the world. So that's 1% of the oil production of the world was off the market. And the price went from $22 a barrel to $28 a barrel, where it more or less sits today. And the reason why the Arabs did that, why OPEC did that, was to see if we had peaked in oil production. Because if we haven't, somebody else would step up production and fill in the 1% that was missing. And no one has. So I want you to understand the importance of this. This does not mean that next year we run out of oil. What it means is we no longer can produce as much oil as everyone in the world wants. So what does that mean? You're the petrochemical company of Gabon, Africa, and you order up oil. And they say, sorry, we can't deliver all that you want. And they go, what do you mean? We got a country to run here. We got fertilizer to make. We got diesel fuel for our trucks. We got to run our cars. You can't tell us we can't buy oil. Well, sorry, we don't have enough. We really just don't quite have enough for you. Well, what do you think the government of Gabon is going to say?
Start bidding.
What if we paid a little more? Could we get enough oil? Well, that's a different story. Sure. Then the energy minister of Ghana calls him and says, what happened? We got shorted on oil this month. And of course he'll say, well, what if we paid a little more? And this starts a cycle that will never end. Okay? You will see a steady increase in the price of oil, pretty much from here on out. It's being kept down right now by bookkeeping Enron-style BS to keep people from knowing just how desperate the situation is. Last year, the importation of finished gasoline in the United States went up 90%. Because, our demands keep going up and we don't have any more refineries.
How about the vast fields and other gasoline seal?
That's counting all that. That's counting all that. No, but while that's being tapped, other oil fields are dropping out. So the rate of growth has stopped and is reversed. We're using 4 times more every year, increased rate, than what we find. So we're talking, and all the governments in the world know this, and they're all in denial. And believe me, denial is not a river in Egypt.
You were saying before that gasoline for cars is actually a waste byproduct, so even if the entire world's fleet of cars were switched to alcohol, we would still be using petroleum for plastics and fertilizers and pharmaceuticals, right? So
Really? Take a look at the changes in agriculture when we start making alcohol. And also alcohol.
Can we use the cellulose for plastic uses and other?
You ever hear of rayon? That's a fabric made of cellulose.
Right.
In fact, in the early part of the century, last century, we had a movement called the Chemergy movement. And everything we make from oil today, they made from plants. And really, there's nothing, no hydrocarbon that's made today that we cannot make from various carbohydrates. For instance, polylactic acid is being made by several companies right now. They make beautiful bags, look just like plain old polyethylene bags, but they rot. They're biodegradable, and they're made from alcohol and lactic acid. So we can do all this stuff. We don't need oil for almost any of the things that we use oil for today. We can use plant-based materials to do it. Sure, it'll cost a little more, but not really, because look at the subsidy we're paying for right now. And also, the cost we have today is about to end. Now, I'm going to kind of try to wrap this up pretty soon, because I said I'd try to finish by 9:30. A lot of us are saying, good, oil's running out, and now the renewables will have to be considered. You don't know what the oil companies have planned for you. Oil shale is one of the big plans that they have, which right now is uneconomical at the current low price of oil. As long as no alternatives come on the line, a point will come where an emergency will get declared and the environmental restrictions on producing oil from shale will be lifted. Oil shale is this rock in the Colorado Rockies, which it has a little bit of oil in it, but it's a hard rock when you look at it. And the way they deal with that is they burn it in caverns underground, and the oily vapors that come off are collected, and from a ton of rock you get 25 gallons of oil. And then what you get is fly ash in enormous quantities, to the point where if we supplied the United States need for oil from oil shale, we would generate 1,500 pounds of toxic waste a year, which is equal to all the toxic waste we currently produce, and it would fill every canyon in the western United States in 20 years. Grand Canyon, every canyon with fly ash. Nothing will grow in the fly ash for 2,500 years. It takes 5 gallons of water to make every gallon of oil shale, because they spray water in the cavern, recover the toxic oily mixture, and the water is permanently ruined. That's why the United States has commodified water so that we can import it from Canada for oil shale. Okay? The reason why we won't sign the treaties in the United Nations making water a right is because the oil companies need it. Okay? And tar sands are almost as bad as oil shale. Coal, they want to take 13 gallons of water to use coal to make methanol, which they then make into gasoline. So it's like taking methanol as another alcohol, which is not as environmentally cool as ethanol, but they won't even let that be out there. They want to take the methanol, 4 gallons of it, put it through a process to make 1.5 gallons of gasoline. It's like taking 4 pounds of steak and making 1.5 pounds of hamburger. It's like crazy. But that's what they have in mind, and that's what they're talking about in all their boardrooms. So it's not a good thing that we're running out of oil if we don't do something about it. And that's what we have to do. Now, the model that I want to see happen with alcohol is not where we open a few stations and let the oil companies sell it. What I think we need to do is a model that's something like what Diane knows about, or what I know about, which is community-supported agriculture. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's a movement where consumers contract directly with the farmer to produce food for them every week. and the people get a box of produce every week as a subscription. We need community-supported energy, where urban consumers or suburban consumers like us, if we're not producing our own alcohol, contract with these farm co-ops, buy the alcohol directly without any intermediates, and sell it to each other on a nonprofit basis. There's a lot of precedent for this, this nonprofit co-ops. But what it takes is the kind of organization we need to do in this country to take power back into our communities away from the people who currently have it. And what's good about it is there's no reason why we can't do it technologically. There's 3 billion gallons of alcohol being produced right now in the United States, mostly by farm cooperatives. Do you know where it goes? It goes into the gasoline as an additive. But those farmers are nervous as hell because they're selling to the enemy, and it's their only customer. I've talked with farmer groups at these various conferences, and they said, if a consumer co-op wanted to buy the alcohol from us, we would love it. Anything to diversify our market so we're not just selling to the oil companies who might cut our throat anytime.
So the fuel that you envision being at the pump somewhere in this area would be bought by these farmers in the Midwest. It wouldn't be.
Well, until we produce it here. I mean, there's a lot of plants that are getting ready to go into production in California, or
If it happened next week or next month,
that's where it comes from.
that's where it comes from.
But once you've got distribution happening, local production can start happening, and there's a market for them to sell the alcohol to. It's the same with the, and use all the other products, the carbon dioxide for food production, the animal feed byproducts to sell to Strauss for milk. In other words, we integrate into the community. Now, there's been studies done back in the 80s, which are still valid today, that if for every 5 billion gallons of alcohol we produce, we would create 1 million jobs, 940,000 jobs. So only producing 15 billion gallons, which is 1/10 of the gasoline we now produce, would recover all the jobs that Bush has destroyed since he took office. And these are permanent jobs because energy never goes away, the need for it. So we're talking about changing a real fundamental nature of our economy, where there's not only people taking power, spending the money in their communities, because if Michael's running a co-op and he takes money in into the nonprofit, and that gets spent on services within the community, that's very different than giving your money to Chevron, who then ships your money out of town to a transnational bank account somewhere. That's constantly draining the local economy, where respending the money within the community gets respent up to 12 times, creating a lot of local wealth. So there's a lot of reasons why we need to retake our energy, control. But, who of us wants to be responsible for what the oil companies are going to do next to our planet? And so that's, if there's any real reason to do it, that's it. Now, at least currently, you get a tax credit up to 53 cents a gallon, 63 cents if it's a small plant, for every gallon you burn in your car. That's a credit, not a deduction. So if you're making the alcohol, or even if you're buying it for $1.10 from the Midwest, you're getting to take 63 cents off your taxes every time you burn a gallon. So you're not even going to necessarily have to pay more to do the environmentally right thing. You end up paying less if you're a taxpayer. And those credits, by the way, you think, oh, the Republicans will get rid of those? They can't. Because if you're in the Midwest and you're a senator or a congressman, you cannot vote against ethanol and expect to survive the next election. So Republicans for 20 years have been trying to get rid of these credits, and they can't do it because they would just lose office. And so they keep getting renewed, and we're going to have those for quite some time. Question? So what I'm trying to say is that alcohol, just like sustainable agriculture, just like a lot of other things that we've been trying to see happen in our world, is a really key organizing place for us to take control back of our communities. Energy is the core of almost everything in our planet. Anything you want to buy is made of capital, labor, and energy. Those three things go into everything. And usually energy is not an issue. The battle in this world is over capital and labor. But now energy is part of this. And we can really change that by doing that ourselves. So let me tell you how dead set, we have to. What I got to say is this is not going to be easy. This is a battle. So you heard a little bit about my efforts to do this back in the 80s on television. I was young at the time. I was 23. I thought, let's have revolution on television like that was possible, So I did a 10-part series for PBS. 10 half-hour shows on how to make alcohol, how to convert cars, how to, build stills, how to do the whole thing. Wrote that book to go along with it. And I thought we were home free. We were on the air on KQED in San Francisco, scheduled to release the series to 140 stations nationwide. I was at the printer with a check in hand to print 10,000 copies of the book. We had 4,000 orders already from the first 4 segments of the show. I got a call, stop the presses. Well, what's going on? They wouldn't talk to me. So I come back from Oregon, I come back to KQED. After several meetings, it finally comes out that Chevron called up and said, what's wrong? You don't like our money? And basically said, we'll withdraw all of our funding for PBS if you don't cancel this series and cancel the book. Which that was a no-brainer. They just went ahead and did that. So, even in the lawsuit that I followed in afterwards, they got to keep the series and not have to air it, because they spent $250,000 on their side of the lawsuit, and I only could raise $75,000. So I got the rights to the book back, and that's it. So they crushed me. I mean, I lost, And they, to this day, in KQED's security vault, my series sits there, and when they go to the Tishman building every year to get their millions from Chevron, there's an oral agreement that says you will not release this series. And for that, we give you a little more money. So I should be happy that they've been extorting Chevron for all these years. But if we would have gotten that series out in 1983, there would have been no Iraq war in 91. There'd be no Iraq war today. There'd be no oligarchy running our goddamn government. This would all be very different. So, I'm going to read you a quote from Helen Caldecott. Kind of finish this up. The vision, this is about politicians. Their vision is limited to their meager 2 to 4 year terms of office. The desire for re-election influences all their decisions. I found sadly that a global view of reality and a sense of moral responsibility for humanity's future are very rare among political figures. But if we can't trust our representatives, who can we trust? The answer is simple: no one but ourselves. We must educate ourselves and then move powerfully as individuals, accepting full responsibility for preserving the planet for our descendants. She wrote that back in the 80s. Nothing has changed. It's really always been up to us, to take the action that needs to be taken. Governments are paralyzed at the prospect of oil running out, and they will do whatever the oil companies tell them to do if they think it'll be an easy out, a save, something that will keep things going the way they are with the least disruption. It's not an option anymore. Oil has peaked. It's going to get to be more and more ugly as time goes on. And it's not an option. We have to do something ourselves. And so that's what the goal of the book is at this point, to get it out there and to get people forming linkages between drivers and producers, the farmers, to take the oil equation completely out of the picture, and for us to deal directly with the people who produce solar energy and go ahead and really change what's going on. And it's really that simple. And there is tremendous effort to make sure you don't know about it. And what I'm trying to do is make sure you do know about it. And now, as they have said in Buddhism, once you have woken from your sleep, you can never go back to sleep quite so soundly. You now all know there is an answer, and it really just takes pushing to make it happen. As little as chipping in and buying a tank and getting alcohol delivered at this point and converting your cars. So this is you haven't heard much about it, but we're making big moves. And getting the public to understand what's going on is what our project's all about. So anyway, that's all I have to say for you tonight. I'd like your support. There's one last thing. One last thing. A lot of people ask me why I wear this hat. And that's because at the end of these talks, I can take it off and I can pass it around to help cover travel costs and stuff.
Alcohol is made from things that have sugar or starch in them, like corn, grains, or other kinds of fruit. No matter what we start with, we're going to cook it down into a sauce, We're going to condition this mash so that we'll be able to ferment it. First we have to cook it into a thick sauce, and then we'll correct the pH by dipping this paper in and seeing what color it turns. Depending on the color that it turns, we'll know what the pH reading is. As the corn becomes thick, we'll have to thin it out with enzymes. Now enzymes are items that come from bacteria or seeds which break starch down into sugar. As the enzymes are mixed in with the corn, they'll break it down very rapidly and thin the corn right out. This will happen hundreds of thousands of times faster than it would in nature. In fact, it gets so thin that it won't even stick to the spoon. Now, we'll often have to correct the pH with lime or acid at different parts of the process to give us the correct conditions for fermentation. Adding acid has to be done carefully, as you can see the reaction, which is quite violent. With the acid added, we'll now be able to check for starch. We'll use household iodine, and as you can see, the starch turns quite purple when we add iodine. This tells us the batch isn't quite done yet. Now, all the stuff we use for making alcohol can be found around the house or at chemical supply. This here is baker's or distiller's yeast, yeast that will go ahead and eat the sugar that is now in the mixture and make it into alcohol. As the yeast are added, they'll first begin to reproduce, as you're seeing right here. As they begin to get much more vigorous in their reproduction, you'll see some quite violent reactions as they begin to produce the gas which makes them float. Now, as the yeast reproduce, over the next 2 or 3 days, they will be producing alcohol until they reach about 10 or 12% alcohol, at which time they will be dead drunk and they will have finished the process. Now, as the yeast heat up the sugar, they also breathe out carbon dioxide, as you can see them bubbling away right here. As long as the yeast are breathing, we know they're alive, and when they stop breathing, the process is over with. The amount of time it takes will vary on the material. Things like grains take a long time. Once it's over, they begin boiling the mixture, and the alcohol vapors that begin to rise through this column. Now, this is a small column, a tabletop model, but as the vapors rise, they will get stronger and stronger in alcohol until they reach quite close to the top, which you're seeing here. This coil cools the vapors to a particular temperature, and depending on the temperature, we can pick any proof we want. The vapors leave this part of the column and enter the condenser. And this is the final phase of the process, where the alcohol is now made into a liquid. Now, the blue liquid here is cold water. The alcohol will be condensing on the outside of the coils in just a few moments. Stills like this are very energy efficient. They're able to produce about a gallon of alcohol using about 1/3 of a gallon's worth of energy. So we're seeing technology that is sophisticated but simple enough for people to use. The clear liquid dripping off is now the alcohol. Now, if we boost up the cooling water a little bit, we'll see quite a bit more of it. And a still like this will only produce 1/2 gallon per hour. More modern stills, ones you'd see in your backyard, would produce more like 80 to 100 gallons in a day, which is the basic size we recommend in our workshops. The alcohol does collect at quite a rapid rate, and in about 1/2 hour of running time, we'll collect enough drips like this to fill up a quart-sized flask. As you can see, the alcohol is quite clear and looks just like water, but there are impurities in it which make it undrinkable. Things like esters and ketones and aldehydes. They all look clear, but they would give you a hangover you'd never forget, or one you may never wake up from. This alcohol is quite strong. In fact, it's well more than necessary to run a car. As you can see from our hydrometer, it's over 190 proof. We only need 160 to 190 proof to run a car. Now, the flame you're seeing, a very faint flame, is alcohol burning. And it's a very clean flame and a very cool burning flame. It's very safe, actually. This is gasoline, which is quite a vigorous flame and quite a dirty one. And what we're going to be seeing is what this does to your engine and also the safety of alcohol. As you can see, alcohol can be put out with water, where gasoline, of course, is only spread by water. Now, as the gasoline burns out, you can see how black the cup has become. That's similar to what happens to the inside of your engine while running on gasoline. As you can see, the alcohol cup is still completely clean. Now, as we use alcohol in vehicles, we start to find very long engine life and very quiet and cool running. In fact, alcohol turns out to be the ideal fuel for internal combustion vehicles. Although we lose a little mileage, about 10 to 12%, the rest of its effects really make up for that small deficit. As you can see, alcohol burns very cool, and I can put my hand on what usually would be a 500-degree exhaust pipe. And running on alcohol is quite good in motorcycles, as the vibration level is quite reduced. In fact, we've even seen Harleys converted to alcohol that were almost civilized. This small bike here even benefits from alcohol's vibration-free running. this is my still here, and as you can see, it has nothing to do with the old vision of a copper coil kettle type moonshine still. In fact, the technology in this still is, let's say, borrowed, not quite stolen, from oil company technology. This still here will produce about 8 to 10 gallons of alcohol per hour, or about 100 gallons in a day. We use pressure and temperature gauges to be able to determine the proof at any time in the process, and we can test the purity right here in the hydrometer. Now, alcohol stills like this are generally fired by wood, and here's the firebox, for instance, on this one. They're also used with natural gas, etc.